The night was unnervingly still, as though the world itself had been holding its breath. A thin mist clung to the cobblestone streets, curling around the bases of ancient walls like ghostly fingers. Torches flickered in the darkness, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to twist and merge with shapes unseen. Somewhere in the distance, the muted clatter of hooves echoed against the silent stone, each step heavy with intent. It was a night that belonged not to ordinary men, but to secrets, old, dangerous, and alive. And somewhere within this murky expanse of shadow and torchlight, an ancient brotherhood convened, their identities hidden even from the most watchful eyes. The air was thick with a sense of ritual, as though every movement, every whispered word, carried weight beyond the understanding of those who had not been chosen to witness it. A procession moved silently through a hidden passage, their robes brushing the floor with soft, deliberate grace. Faces were obscured beneath hoods, but even in the dim glow, one could sense the intensity of their focus. There was a language spoken here without words, a rhythm in their steps that spoke of obedience, of loyalty, and of a knowledge that had been preserved for centuries. Each member carried an object, some a simple scroll, others small, intricate artifacts whose purpose only they understood. Their hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what was about to unfold. This was no ordinary gathering, and yet, to an outside observer, it might appear as nothing more than a cluster of men moving through the night. In the center of a secluded chamber, lit by the warm, golden glow of candles, stood an altar carved from stone so ancient it seemed to absorb the shadows themselves. Symbols unknown to ordinary men were etched into its surface, intricate geometric patterns and cryptic characters that seemed to shift when not directly looked at. The air smelled faintly of incense, mingled with something darker, more metallic, perhaps the echo of countless centuries of secrecy. The leader of the gathering stepped forward, his movements deliberate, commanding, yet reverent. Every eye turned toward him, and the silence that followed was almost unbearable, pregnant with expectation. He raised his hands, and a hush fell over the chamber that was heavier than the stillness outside. There was a weight to the moment that pressed against the very bones of those present. He began to speak, his voice low but unwavering, carrying a cadence that seemed to reach into places within the mind untouched by ordinary language. He spoke of promises made long ago, of knowledge entrusted to those who would protect it, and of a destiny intertwined with forces both human and divine. As he spoke, the air seemed to pulse with energy, as if the room itself were alive and listening. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, time had slowed, stretched taut, and yet fragile, as though the very act of speaking these words kept the universe in delicate balance. The members of the Brotherhood repeated oaths, each phrase weighted with solemnity and fear. These were not mere words. They were contracts, lifelines, and warnings all at once. To speak falsely here, or to betray the trust placed upon them, would not simply bring shame. It would invite consequences that history itself might not forgive. In this chamber, they were not men of titles or lands. They were keepers of something far older, far more dangerous than any crown or army. They were guardians of a legacy that had survived fire, war, and betrayal, and tonight, they were reminded once more of the cost of preserving it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, broke the trance. A whisper from the corner of the room. Heads turned instinctively, but the shadow there shifted as if it had never been a presence at all. It was a reminder that even within this sanctuary, vigilance was necessary. The Brotherhood had learned through countless generations that knowledge was both a treasure and a trap. Those who sought it openly were crushed, while those who sought it in silence were sometimes consumed by it. Here, in the flickering candlelight, the members understood the paradox fully. Power gained through secrecy was absolute, yet it carried a weight no mortal could bear lightly. The ritual continued, slow and deliberate. Scrolls were unrolled, and inscriptions examined with meticulous care. Strange symbols were traced with fingers trembling not from cold, but from reverence. Some of the writings spoke of the construction of temples, others of celestial alignments, and some hinted at codes hidden in plain sight for centuries. There was a rhythm here, a pulse in the air that seemed to resonate with the beating of hearts. As the leader pointed toward a particular scroll, he spoke again, his voice now softer, almost a whisper meant only for those close enough to hear. The words hinted at a secret so profound that it could alter the understanding of history itself. The room grew colder as though the very knowledge carried a chill, and the members leaned in, straining to grasp what was being revealed. Outside the chamber, the night seemed alive with unseen watchers. It was as if the world itself knew that something momentous was taking place, and it waited silently for the outcome. The torches lining the corridor flickered as a cold draft swept past, carrying the scent of damp stone and forgotten corridors. Each member of the Brotherhood knew that this night could be remembered or erased entirely from history, depending on what transpired within these walls. Some had come seeking clarity, others seeking power, yet all had come knowing that the line between enlightenment and destruction was razor-thin. As the ceremony reached its peak, the leader lifted an ancient object, long thought lost to time. Its surface gleamed faintly in the candlelight, and every face in the room reflected a mixture of awe and apprehension. This was no ordinary relic. It was a key, a vessel, and a symbol all at once. To possess it was to carry responsibility beyond comprehension, and yet the members understood instinctively that they were chosen. The oaths taken tonight would bind them, not only to one another but to a lineage of secrecy stretching back to the dawn of civilization. The weight of history pressed down upon their shoulders, and in that moment, they were acutely aware that the world outside would never understand their purpose. The ceremony concluded in silence. No applause, no cheers. Only the soft exhale of breath and the slow extinguishing of candles. Each member retreated to the shadows, carrying with them not only the physical objects but the invisible burden of knowledge. Outside, the mist swirled as if marking the passage of these silent guardians. And somewhere beyond the walls, in a world that would never suspect the events of this night, life continued as usual, oblivious to the existence of a brotherhood whose influence might stretch across continents and centuries. In the quiet aftermath, a single thought lingered in the air like a whisper too faint to catch. What if the world we see, the history we accept, is shaped not by kings and conquerors alone, but by shadows moving in silence, keeping secrets too dangerous to reveal? And in that question, the true weight of the night settled, leaving an unshakable sense of awe, fear, and anticipation for what was to come. Long before the Templars drew their swords and took their vows, long before the echo of crusading armies shook the Holy Land, there were whispers, fragments of a story that refused to die, scattered across dusty scrolls and hidden inscriptions carved into stone walls. These were the traces of brotherhoods that operated in the margins of history, secret societies whose names were never spoken aloud, yet whose influence, some say, stretched across continents and centuries. They were known only to a select few, often dismissed as legend or myth, yet the consistency of the stories suggested a lineage older than any empire, older even than the kingdoms of men. In these ancient whispers, there was a pattern, a deliberate hand guiding events from behind the curtain, shaping the world in ways that would remain invisible to ordinary eyes. Evidence of such hidden groups is scarce, elusive, and contradictory, appearing in the most unexpected places. In the catacombs beneath Jerusalem, carvings of intertwined symbols hint at practices and knowledge deliberately shielded from public view. In remote monasteries, marginal notes in forgotten manuscripts suggest the careful preservation of wisdom that challenged the accepted teachings of the day. Across the deserts of Egypt, faint markings on temple walls hint at secret initiations, ceremonies that invoked not only devotion but understanding, training those deemed worthy in ways that transcended ordinary comprehension. These societies were not merely collections of men. They were living repositories of memory, of knowledge, and of strategies honed over generations, guarding truths so potent they could disrupt kingdoms if revealed recklessly. The founding of such brotherhoods seems inseparable from the earliest ambitions of humankind to understand the divine. Ancient cultures across the Near East spoke of sacred temples, divine wisdom, and coded knowledge passed down through select intermediaries. In each story, there is a recurring theme. Only those trained, only those tested, were entrusted with truths that could not be handled by the masses. The line between enlightenment and madness was dangerously thin, and the keepers of these truths bore a burden as immense as the secrets themselves. The more one delves into these early hints, the more the pattern emerges. A hidden continuity, linking civilizations from Jerusalem to Babylon, Egypt to the Mediterranean, a shadowy network safeguarding mysteries that might otherwise vanish into the dust of forgotten history. Even the earliest historical texts betray hints of this covert influence. Chronicles of kings and empires, when read closely, contain references that seem out of place. Advisors who spoke in riddles, emissaries whose origins were obscured, rituals performed in secret chambers beneath palaces. Some scholars suggest these anomalies are nothing more than embellishments, errors, or folklore. Yet when similar motifs appear in distant regions and across centuries, a more compelling explanation arises. A clandestine lineage, transferring knowledge quietly, subtly, ensuring that its survival depended not on force or wealth, but on discretion and secrecy. It is as if the world itself were a chessboard, and these hidden custodians moved unseen, guiding events from behind a veil that ordinary men could neither pierce nor even suspect existed. Some of the earliest whispers mention a connection to the construction of sacred sites, to architectural choices that encoded messages beyond the understanding of casual observers. Temples, pyramids, and monuments across the ancient world bear signs, geometric patterns, celestial alignments, hidden chambers that defy purely functional explanations. Could these have been the work of ordinary masons, or were they the imprint of hands trained in secret knowledge, shaping not only stone but the understanding of those who would come after? In this view, architecture itself becomes a language, and history, when read carefully, reveals itself not as a linear record of kings and battles, but as a tapestry coated with messages intended for those initiated into the mysteries. Travelers, pilgrims, and chroniclers occasionally glimpsed the outer edges of these hidden societies. Their accounts are often cryptic, fragmented, or dismissed as allegory, yet recurring patterns emerge. There are descriptions of gatherings in moonlit courtyards, the careful tracing of symbols in sand or on parchment, initiations that tested both courage and moral integrity. In some accounts, young novices were trained in ways that combined spiritual discipline, intellectual rigor, and physical endurance, a holistic preparation that transformed the uninitiated into keepers of knowledge. The purpose of such rigor was twofold: to protect the secrets from those unworthy, and to instill in the chosen a sense of responsibility that bordered on reverence. In these accounts, the underlying truth is rarely stated outright, but it is always implied. Knowledge is power, and the wrong hands could destroy both the seeker and the world they inhabit. Legends speak of cryptic mentors, figures shrouded in mystery who guided initiates through labyrinthine paths of learning. Some were scholars, others warriors. Some lived as hermits, others walked courts and markets in disguise. They appeared where they were needed, then vanished without a trace, leaving only lessons, symbols, and questions that would haunt those who encountered them. Even the most meticulous records often fail to name these figures, suggesting an intentional erasure to protect both their identities and the knowledge they guarded. Yet their influence lingers like a shadow over the pages of history, a reminder that even the most powerful kings, the most ambitious generals, were occasionally nudged by hands unseen. It is within this context that we begin to see the lineage that would eventually feed into the Knights Templar. The Templars did not emerge in a vacuum. They inherited a world already shaped by hidden custodians of knowledge. The brotherhoods that came before them may have been dispersed, their ranks thinned by war, plague, and persecution, yet their methods, symbols, and philosophies endured. When the Templars took their vows, swore their oaths, and set forth on crusades, they were stepping into a role that carried echoes of these ancient custodians. Some Templar leaders were rumored to have possessed access to knowledge far beyond the reach of ordinary clergy or nobility. Manuscripts, relics, and traditions passed down from older orders were said to be in their safekeeping, making them more than knights. They were also keepers of a hidden truth, a dangerous inheritance that would one day seal their fate. Even today, historians and researchers struggle to reconcile the evidence. References to secret teachings appear in scattered fragments, often only detectable through careful comparison across centuries and cultures. Some hint at the use of numerology, astrology, and symbolism in the planning of sacred architecture and rituals. Others suggest the existence of cryptic codes hidden within religious texts, texts that were considered canonical yet may have been edited or interpreted to obscure hidden meanings. The tantalizing consistency of these patterns suggests more than coincidence. It is as if history itself was a palimpsest, with layers of knowledge concealed beneath the surface, awaiting those patient, observant, and daring enough to uncover it. The challenge of understanding these early brotherhoods lies not only in the scarcity of sources but in the very nature of secrecy. The true custodians never sought recognition, and the lessons they preserved were meant for a select few. Their survival depended upon discretion, and their influence was deliberately obscured by myth, ritual, and allegory. The few who have glimpsed fragments of this knowledge often describe an overwhelming sense of awe, a realization that the familiar world is only a surface layer, beneath which flows a current of understanding far older and more profound than history textbooks admit. It is here, in the shadows of this ancient network, that the story of the Order of Solomon begins to take shape. Long before the Templars rise to prominence, these hidden custodians were shaping minds, protecting knowledge, and ensuring that certain truths remained out of reach of those unprepared to wield them responsibly. They were not concerned with glory or conquest, but with the continuity of a legacy, one that spanned centuries and connected the sacred with the strategic, the mystical with the practical. They understood that even the smallest hint of revelation could change the course of empires, and so they moved in silence, leaving behind whispers for those willing to listen, and puzzles for those who were not. And so the stage was set, centuries before the Templars, in hidden chambers and secret chambers, on dusty scrolls and weathered stones, for a story that would intertwine faith, ambition, and danger. It is a story whose threads continue to weave through history, whose influence can still be traced in the most unexpected corners of our world. To follow it is to step into shadows, to walk paths that few dare to tread, and to confront the possibility that the world as we know it is only a fragment of what has truly been. The whispers of the hidden, faint though they may be, still echo, inviting those who listen to ask the question that will guide every discovery to come. What if the forces shaping history were never visible, yet always present, guiding the fate of nations and the destiny of men? Long before the first Crusaders set foot in Jerusalem, before kings and conquerors carved empires from the land, there stood a monument whose significance would echo through the ages, long after stone and mortar had weathered beneath wind and sun. Solomon's temple was more than a house of worship. It was a beacon of human ambition, faith, and mystery, a structure designed not only to honor the divine but to contain knowledge encoded in its very foundations. Built on a hill that seemed to touch the heavens, the temple radiated power both visible and hidden. To those who gazed upon it, it was magnificent. To those initiated into its secrets, it was a map, a key, and a repository of wisdom beyond ordinary comprehension. The stories of its construction are legendary. King Solomon, said to possess unparalleled wisdom, marshaled artisans, masons, and scholars from across the known world. Their hands carved intricate motifs into stone and wood, each pattern chosen with intent, each measurement calculated according to principles that blended mathematics, astronomy, and esoteric knowledge. Some say the temple's proportions were aligned with celestial events, that its dimensions mirrored constellations, and that hidden chambers contained symbols that spoke to those who knew how to read them. Every detail, the thickness of the walls, the placement of pillars, the spacing of doors, was imbued with meaning, as if the temple itself were a living document, encoding truths too dangerous for ordinary minds to grasp. There were whispers that the temple was a repository of ancient knowledge far older than Solomon himself. Scrolls, tablets, and relics brought from distant lands were said to reside within its walls, each carefully preserved and protected. Some contained instructions for understanding the cosmos, others instructions for constructing sacred geometry that resonated with the natural world. There were tales of chambers that housed objects whose power was both spiritual and practical. Instruments designed to measure time and the stars, artifacts that could heal, and devices whose purpose had been lost, but whose presence suggested a depth of wisdom beyond imagination. The temple was a sanctuary not only of God but of knowledge, a vault whose guardians were chosen carefully, trained in disciplines that spanned the intellectual and mystical alike. Legends speak of a secret inner sanctum, accessible only to the highest initiates, where the air was thick with incense and the walls glimmered with the faint reflection of gold and precious stones. Here, the veil between the human and the divine was said to be thin, and those permitted entry were believed to glimpse truths that could alter their understanding of life itself. It is here, according to some accounts, that the seeds of the Brotherhood now linked to the Templars were first planted. Men trained within the inner sanctum were entrusted with knowledge that was both a gift and a burden, knowledge that demanded discretion and courage. They were instructed to carry these teachings outward, but never to reveal them recklessly, for the world was not yet ready to bear such illumination. The temple's influence was immediate and profound. Not only was it a religious center, but it became a hub for scholars, architects, and envoys from distant lands. Its construction attracted observers from far and wide, many of whom would later claim to understand its secrets, though only a select few ever truly did. Those who witnessed its creation spoke in awe of the precision, the beauty, and the sense that the building itself contained a language waiting to be deciphered. Some suggested that its very stones emitted a resonance, a subtle vibration that could be felt by those attuned to it. Others claimed that the temple's design contained hidden corridors and chambers, some of which were deliberately left undiscovered, a silent testament to the knowledge it safeguarded. There are accounts that suggest the temple's treasures were not only symbolic but practical in ways that would astound later generations. Some scrolls were said to contain calculations for harnessing energy from natural forces, diagrams that mapped the heavens in ways only the initiated could comprehend. Others spoke of codes hidden in the arrangement of ceremonial objects, designs that could only be interpreted through rigorous study of mathematics, astronomy, and geometry. In this way, the temple became a school, a library, and a vault, its secrets preserved for those deemed worthy and hidden from those whose intentions were less pure. Every action, every measurement, every choice of material carried multiple layers of significance, each waiting to be decoded by minds prepared for the challenge. Yet the temple was more than a center of knowledge. It was also a crucible of human ambition and divine politics. Kings, priests, and advisors jostled for influence over its construction, each seeking favor or insight, each aware that to touch the sacred was to wield tremendous power. Stories tell of rivalries, whispered intrigues, and the careful selection of those allowed to enter the inner sanctum. Some chroniclers claim that Solomon's wisdom was not only in his understanding of the divine, but in his ability to manage these complex human dynamics, ensuring that the knowledge preserved within the temple remained protected, and that its custodians remained loyal. In this delicate balance, the temple functioned not only as a spiritual center, but as a fortress of intelligence, a silent sentinel guarding insights that could reshape kingdoms. Over the centuries, the temple became a symbol not only of faith but of a hidden heritage. Its destruction, whether by fire, conquest, or neglect, did not erase the knowledge contained within it. Some claim that priests and scholars smuggled scrolls and relics out before the walls fell, secreting them away in caves, tombs, and distant lands. Others suggest that the temple's layout itself was a memory, a blueprint encoded in legend, architecture, and ritual, a guide that later secret societies would use to reconstruct or preserve what was lost. Through these acts of preservation, a lineage of guardians emerged, men and women who would later influence events far beyond Jerusalem, whose wisdom and secrecy would echo in the formation of groups such as the Templars and the hidden Brotherhood now known as the Order of Solomon. Even in modern times, archaeologists, historians, and esoteric scholars search for traces of this lost knowledge. Cryptic references in texts, architectural echoes in later religious structures, and obscure symbols etched into the stones of surviving buildings all suggest a continuity of purpose. The fascination with Solomon's temple persists not merely because of its spiritual or historical importance, but because it represents a human desire to access truths too profound, too powerful to be revealed to all. The temple is at once real and mythic, historical and symbolic, a focal point where the divine, the intellectual, and the secret converge. And yet, for all its magnificence and mystery, the temple's most enduring legacy may not be its stones or its treasures, but the lineage it created. Those entrusted with its secrets carried knowledge across generations, weaving it into the fabric of subsequent societies and orders. It is here that the hidden Brotherhood first appears as more than legend, emerging as a living thread connecting ancient wisdom to the knights and guardians of later centuries. Through careful mentorship, initiation, and secrecy, the essence of Solomon's vision survived, traveling through time in subtle forms, influencing architecture, politics, and even the philosophy of warfare, always operating just out of reach of the uninitiated, always hidden in plain sight. To contemplate Solomon's temple, therefore, is not simply to marvel at its beauty or historical importance, but to consider the weight of knowledge preserved in silence. It is to acknowledge that the foundation stones of civilizations may not lie in armies or empires, but in the careful guardianship of truths that the world is not yet ready to comprehend. And as the hidden Brotherhood moved forward through the centuries, carrying the temple's lessons with them, they created a legacy that would one day intersect with the Templars, entwining the sacred, the secret, and the strategic in ways that would change the course of history itself. The echoes of the temple continue to ripple, faint but undeniable, in symbols, texts, and rituals that survived through ages of upheaval and destruction. Those who follow these whispers find themselves drawn into a labyrinth of understanding, where every revelation opens new questions, and every discovery hints at secrets still unrevealed. The Temple of Solomon was more than stone and gold. It was a crucible of human aspiration and divine mystery, a beacon whose light has guided shadowed hands for millennia, shaping a history that is at once known, hidden, and eternal. By the time the first Templar Knights took their vows, the world was already a tapestry of hidden currents and whispered legacies. The Crusades had swept across the Holy Land, leaving behind blood-soaked battlefields and cities brimming with both hope and despair. Amid this turmoil, a new kind of order began to take shape, one that was unlike any military or religious organization the world had yet seen. They were warriors, yes, but also custodians of knowledge, inheritors of a tradition whose roots stretched back to Solomon's temple, to secret brotherhoods that had long moved unseen through history. Their swords were raised in the light of faith, yet their true mission was often cloaked in shadows, guided by wisdom that few could comprehend. The origins of the Knights Templar were humble and austere, born not from ambition for wealth or power, but from a sense of sacred duty. They were initially tasked with protecting pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, safeguarding the devout from bandits and marauders. Their early numbers were small, their resources meager, yet their resolve was immense. Even in these earliest days, there were hints that the order carried more than a martial mission. Some chroniclers write of secret instructions given to the knights, texts and teachings that went beyond simple religious observance, hinting at deeper knowledge of sacred geometry, ancient rituals, and mystical symbols. The men who joined were not only fighters. They were scholars, ascetics, and initiates into a legacy that had survived centuries in whispers and shadows. The rise of the Templars was rapid, almost miraculous. Within decades, they became a force to be reckoned with across Europe and the Holy Land. Castles and fortresses were constructed with precision, banks and treasuries established that allowed them to fund crusades and wield influence far beyond the battlefield. Yet even in their growing wealth and power, there remained an underlying current of secrecy, a sense that the order existed to guard something more valuable than gold or territory. Legends hint that their wealth was often a means to an end, resources gathered not for personal gain but to protect relics, manuscripts, and knowledge handed down from older, hidden brotherhoods. These treasures were said to contain insights into history, astronomy, and the natural world, encoded in ways meant to be understood only by the initiated. Initiation into the order was a solemn affair. The vows the knights took of poverty, chastity, and obedience were only the outward manifestations of a deeper commitment. Behind these promises lay secret rites that tested both intellect and courage. Some sources speak of rituals conducted in hidden chambers, in which novices were guided through symbols and teachings that echoed the wisdom preserved from Solomon's temple. Each step of the initiation was designed to awaken awareness of the world's hidden structures, patterns in the heavens, cycles in history, and the interconnectedness of human action and divine will. Only those deemed worthy, only those capable of bearing both knowledge and responsibility, were allowed to ascend through the ranks, becoming not merely warriors but guardians of an ancient, sacred inheritance. Despite the secrecy, the order's influence became visible, and its reputation spread across Europe and the Levant. Their distinctive white mantles adorned with a red cross became symbols not only of martial prowess but of something deeper, a mark of initiation into a brotherhood whose reach extended beyond the battlefield. While the common world saw knights and crusaders, there were whispers among scholars, clergy, and kings of the Templars access to knowledge considered forbidden, of texts and objects that could alter understanding of faith, politics, and the cosmos. Some believed that they had inherited wisdom that allowed them to foresee events, to strategize with uncanny foresight, and to influence the course of nations, all while remaining shrouded in mystery. It is in this context that the Templars' dual nature becomes clear. On the surface, they were the devout protectors of the faithful. Beneath that, they were custodians of a hidden lineage. Manuscripts speak of codes embedded in their architectural works, of symbols carefully placed in churches and fortresses, and of rituals echoing patterns first glimpsed in the designs of Solomon's temple. Their libraries, hidden from public view, were said to contain manuscripts preserved from the fall of Jerusalem, some written in ciphers, others in languages long forgotten. These texts were not merely scholarly. They were practical guides, offering insight into strategy, navigation, engineering, and perhaps even metaphysical knowledge that would seem impossible to the uninitiated. Rumors of relics and artifacts in the Templars' possession only added to the aura of mystery. Some spoke of objects that had been removed from the Temple of Solomon itself, treasures that carried not only historical significance but esoteric power. Others claimed the knights guarded documents that revealed connections between sacred geometry, celestial movements, and the cycles of empires. Whether these rumors were true or exaggerated, they contributed to a perception that the Templars were more than men. They were stewards of a hidden truth, moving through a world unready to comprehend their purpose. This perception, however, would soon draw both admiration and fear, planting seeds that would lead to their dramatic downfall. Even within the order, there were whispers of tension and ambition. The Templars were not immune to human flaws. Some sought glory, some coveted power, and others wrestled with the burden of knowledge too vast for a single lifetime to comprehend. Leadership required not only skill in war but wisdom in discerning who could be trusted with what. Legends tell of internal councils in which disputes were resolved not only with arguments but with trials of character, tests designed to reveal integrity, loyalty, and the ability to bear secrets. The Templars understood that one careless revelation could imperil everything, that knowledge was both shield and weapon, and that safeguarding it required vigilance as intense as any battlefield strategy. Their relationship with kings and the Church was equally complex. While sworn to obedience to the Pope, the Templars sometimes acted independently, guided by their understanding of secrets older than any earthly institution. Monarchs relied on them for military strength. Financiers depended on their resources, and yet all were aware, consciously or not, that the knights possessed insights beyond the ordinary. This delicate balance of power, visible obedience masking hidden authority, would come to define the order and set the stage for the dramatic events that would unfold centuries later. It is perhaps this duality, warriors in white mantles, scholars of secret knowledge, that makes the Templars so compelling to the imagination. They were men of faith, yet their faith was intertwined with wisdom that challenged and extended ordinary understanding. They were fighters, yet their battles were not only against armies but against ignorance, chance, and the entropy of lost knowledge. They were custodians of a legacy stretching back to ancient Israel, to the very heart of Solomon's temple, carrying forward principles, symbols, and codes that would survive long after the stones of Jerusalem crumbled. And so, the knights marched onward, their influence spreading across lands both holy and profane. Each fortress built, each pilgrimage protected, each scroll preserved was part of a larger, unseen mission. They were not merely participants in the history of the Crusades. They were bearers of a hidden lineage, a silent thread connecting past wisdom to the unfolding present. As they rode through deserts and mountains, as they strategized in courts and councils, the echoes of Solomon's temple guided them, a quiet force shaping decisions and destinies that history would eventually record in fragments and whispers. In understanding the rise of the Templars, one begins to see the convergence of visible action and hidden purpose. What the world saw was knights, crusaders, and defenders of the faith. What few realized was that each decision, each mission, and each oath was informed by principles passed down through secret brotherhoods, whose knowledge predated the construction of kingdoms and empires. It is this convergence of devotion, intellect, and secrecy that would eventually elevate the Templars beyond the realm of ordinary history, setting them on a path that would intertwine with betrayal, legend, and the enduring enigma of the hidden Order of Solomon. The wealth of the Templars was the stuff of legend, whispered across courts and markets with awe, envy, and suspicion. To outsiders, their treasures were measured in gold, silver, and jewels. Countless coins amassed from donations, spoils of battle, and the offerings of grateful pilgrims. Their fortresses gleamed with the glow of precious metals. Their vaults held the wealth of kings, and yet, for all this opulence, their truest treasures were far more elusive, far more dangerous. These were not simply riches for comfort or power. They were artifacts, relics, and manuscripts imbued with knowledge that had survived centuries, sometimes millennia, and whose significance was understood only by those initiated into the secret lineage they had inherited. Legends spoke of relics so sacred and potent that to possess them was to hold dominion not merely over land or men, but over understanding itself. Some claimed the Templars had acquired fragments of the Ark of the Covenant, objects once housed in the inner sanctum of Solomon's temple. Others whispered of scrolls containing astronomical calculations, geometric codes, and maps to hidden treasures or sacred sites long forgotten by the common world. These were not ornamental curiosities, but instruments of knowledge, containing insights into the natural world, the movements of the heavens, and the patterns of human destiny. To those outside the order, such tales seemed fantastical, but within the Brotherhood, these treasures were the heartbeat of their purpose, the tangible proof of a hidden inheritance that demanded protection at any cost. The Templars' ability to amass wealth was matched only by their meticulous methods of safeguarding it. Fortresses were constructed with vaults so secret and intricate that only a handful of trusted members knew the routes and mechanisms required to reach them. Records were encoded in ciphers, and archives were hidden behind false walls or beneath the stone floors of chapels. These measures were not merely practical, they were philosophical. The order understood that knowledge, like gold, could corrupt or empower depending on who possessed it. The distinction between a worthy guardian and a fool was razor-thin, and the Templars' systems of secrecy reflected a deep understanding of the responsibility inherent in stewardship of such power. Some relics were believed to hold spiritual potency, objects capable of invoking awe or even terror. The stories tell of chalices, amulets, and ceremonial implements that had been safeguarded since the days of Solomon himself, passed carefully from custodian to custodian. A cup or pendant might seem ordinary to the uninitiated, yet it could contain coded instructions or symbols that revealed celestial alignments or sacred rituals. There were those who swore that these objects could heighten perception, sharpen intuition, or grant insight into patterns of history invisible to most. To possess them required not just faith but wisdom, discipline, and the courage to confront truths that could unsettle the mind as well as the soul. Even more compelling than tangible relics were the manuscripts and codices hidden within the order's libraries. Some were painstakingly copied by Templar scribes, who preserved knowledge lost elsewhere, including texts from the classical world, mystical treatises from the East, and fragments of writings from Solomon's temple itself. Many of these were encrypted or encoded in ways that required years of study to decipher. Within these pages lay instructions for constructing sacred spaces, understanding cosmic patterns, and performing rituals designed to harmonize the human mind with the universe. It was a curriculum of hidden wisdom, a pathway for the mind to access truths the unprepared were warned to avoid. Scholars centuries later would marvel at these works, often stumbling upon their remnants with only the faintest understanding of their original purpose. Rumors of the Templars' treasures often bordered on the fantastical. Some spoke of maps pointing to hidden cities, chambers filled with gold infused with mystical properties, or instruments capable of calculating celestial events with supernatural precision. Others hinted that they possessed objects tied to prophetic visions, instruments that could decode the future or reveal patterns in human affairs invisible to ordinary perception. While many of these claims were likely exaggerated or misinterpreted, their very existence in legend underscores a central truth. The Templars were more than warriors. They were custodians of something profoundly consequential. Their treasures were not vanity or excess. They were safeguards, keys, and records, each carrying layers of meaning carefully preserved against time and ignorance. The allure of these treasures inevitably drew attention, admiration, and, eventually, fear. Kings coveted their wealth, rival orders sought to challenge their authority, and the Church watched warily, aware that the Templars' growing power could rival even papal influence. Some feared the knowledge they guarded, concerned that its revelation could destabilize established authority or challenge conventional understanding of faith and history. Others sought the relics for personal gain, driven by curiosity, ambition, or greed. The Templars' survival depended not only on martial skill, but on their ability to navigate these political and spiritual tensions, maintaining secrecy while exercising influence behind the scenes. Among the treasures said to be most feared were those linked directly to Solomon's temple. Objects believed to have been recovered from the ruins, or at least modeled after them, carried both religious and esoteric significance. Some claimed that the Templars possessed keys to sacred geometry embedded in the temple's design, instructions for harnessing cosmic forces, or relics capable of bridging the human and divine. It is impossible to separate fact from myth in these accounts, but the persistence of such stories across centuries speaks to a shared recognition. The Templars were safeguarding something powerful, something that could alter the balance of faith, knowledge, and power if revealed indiscriminately. Even within the order, handling such treasures demanded discipline and reverence. Novices were trained not only in martial skill but in the ethical and spiritual responsibilities of stewardship. Mishandling a relic, misinterpreting a manuscript, or revealing its purpose prematurely could have devastating consequences, both practical and spiritual. In this sense, the Templars' wealth was not only a resource but a test, a reflection of the order's capacity to carry the weight of history itself. Each object, each scroll, each coded manuscript was a thread in a larger tapestry, a link connecting ancient wisdom to the unfolding present, and the knights who safeguarded them were both its guardians and its interpreters. The Templars' treasures also played a practical role in consolidating influence. Fortresses, banks, and networks of allies across Europe and the Holy Land enabled the order to mobilize quickly, protect pilgrims, and support crusading efforts. Wealth was a tool, yes, but its deeper purpose was always tied to preservation and protection. Protection of knowledge, protection of the faithful, and protection of secrets whose value transcended gold. In this way, the Templars became both visible and invisible forces in the medieval world. A formidable army of warriors on one hand, and on the other, a silent current of guardianship flowing beneath the surface of history. Yet the very existence of such treasures inevitably sowed the seeds of envy and suspicion. Rumors spread, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes deliberately manipulated, portraying the Templars as heretics, alchemists, or manipulators of divine power. The more secretive the order remained, the more dangerous it appeared to outsiders. And so, the treasures that symbolized wisdom and continuity became the reason for fear and persecution. The treasures were a magnet for intrigue, a spark that would ignite the events leading to the dramatic trials, betrayals, and executions that history would record with both horror and fascination. In the end, the Templars' treasures were far more than wealth. They were the embodiment of a mission that stretched across centuries. They represented knowledge preserved, power wielded responsibly, and faith intertwined with wisdom. They were tangible proof of a lineage reaching back to the hidden brotherhoods and the mysteries of Solomon's temple, a reminder that history is never only what it appears to be on the surface. Every coin, every scroll, every relic told a story of guardianship, secrecy, and the weight of truths too potent for ordinary men to bear. And as the shadows lengthened over medieval Europe, The world would soon witness the consequences of such power, the envy it inspired, and the lengths to which men would go to possess what they could not fully comprehend. Even within an order as disciplined and revered as the Templars, human nature could not be entirely tamed. Beneath the immaculate white mantles adorned with the Red Cross, beneath the solemn vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, there existed ambition, envy, and fear. The very knowledge that elevated the order also carried the seeds of tension. Some knights coveted authority beyond their station, hungered for access to the secrets others guarded, or quietly questioned the wisdom of leadership decisions that seemed dictated by unseen forces. In the cloistered chambers of their fortresses, where scrolls whispered truths older than kingdoms, alliances were forged, tested, and sometimes broken in silence. The Templars' greatest battles were often not against foreign armies but against the subtle, corrosive impulses within themselves. The first signs of betrayal were almost imperceptible, manifesting in whispered words, furtive glances, and the subtle manipulation of information. A knight who had been entrusted with a rare manuscript might delay its delivery, citing caution, while secretly studying its contents for personal advantage. Others sought favor with influential figures outside the order, hinting at knowledge they were not authorized to reveal. Small disputes over interpretations of sacred texts, over the correct application of rituals, or the placement of relics began to emerge as points of tension. These minor fissures, unnoticed by the untrained eye, were the precursors to fractures that would later threaten the very foundation of the Brotherhood. Trust was the currency of the Templars, and its violation was a crime far graver than any misdeed of arms. The knights were bound by oaths not only to their faith but to one another, and to the stewardship of knowledge passed down from the hidden lineages that stretched back to Solomon's temple. Yet even in this sacred bond, human flaws persisted. Ambition could make a man overreach. Fear could make him cautious to the point of secrecy. Envy could turn loyalty into manipulation. Within the shadowed corridors of their strongholds, subtle power struggles unfolded. Leadership councils convened in solemn secrecy, discussing not only strategy and resources but the temperament, loyalty, and reliability of individual knights. Each decision carried weight, for a misstep could compromise access to relics, manuscripts, and knowledge whose preservation had been entrusted to them over centuries. Some of the earliest betrayals were moral rather than outright treachery. A knight might reveal a fragment of knowledge to someone deemed trustworthy, only for that trust to be misused. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Objects might be mishandled, scrolls copied without authorization, and secrets inadvertently revealed to outsiders. Each act, however minor, sent ripples through the order, creating suspicion, tension, and unease. The Templars had learned that human desire and curiosity were forces as dangerous as any external enemy, capable of unraveling even the most disciplined brotherhood if left unchecked. Legends recount a particular episode in which a group of knights, entrusted with guarding relics believed to have been recovered from Solomon's temple, grew increasingly divided over their interpretation of the artifact's purpose. Some argued that the relics were to be preserved in strict secrecy, a record of divine knowledge to be shared only with the highest initiates. Others believed that their power could be harnessed more openly, that the knowledge contained within should be used to influence kings, direct battles, or secure the order's dominance. This philosophical schism, though subtle, created factions within the order, each wary of the other, each convinced that their approach was morally and strategically correct. The tension, once buried beneath layers of ritual and obedience, began to surface in quiet confrontations, debates, and subtle acts of defiance. Envy also played a potent role in the unfolding drama. Knights who observed their peers gaining favor, entrusted with sacred texts, or granted access to hidden chambers sometimes harbored resentment. The perception that one's dedication and loyalty were undervalued could fester into discontent, subtly undermining unity. A slip of judgment, a word spoken too freely, or a glance exchanged in secrecy could escalate into far-reaching consequences. The very structure of the order, its hierarchy, its secrecy, its sacred oaths, was designed to minimize these risks, yet human emotion proved difficult to regulate. Even the most disciplined knights occasionally succumbed to impulses that, while understandable, threatened the cohesion of a brotherhood built upon trust above all else. Fear, too, was a silent adversary. The Templars operated in a world of constant danger, both external and internal. The threat of attack from rival forces was ever present, but the fear of betrayal from within was perhaps even more insidious. Rumors of corruption, whispers of secret allegiances, and the possibility of spies in their midst created an atmosphere of perpetual vigilance. Knights were trained to be alert not only to the movements of armies but to the subtle signals of disloyalty among their own ranks. Every shared meal, every council meeting, every whispered conversation carried potential significance. The order's very survival depended on discernment, on the ability to detect subtle cues that indicated whether a brother could be trusted with the secrets of Solomon's legacy. The burden of guarding ancient knowledge amplified the stakes of internal conflict. The relics, manuscripts, and coded teachings were not mere curiosities. They were vessels of wisdom and power that, if mishandled, could disrupt both faith and politics. Knights who underestimated the responsibility, who acted out of ambition or fear, risked more than personal disgrace. They endangered the preservation of a lineage that had survived wars, exile, and centuries of secrecy. The internal betrayals, therefore, were not only moral failings. They were existential threats to the mission the order had been entrusted to carry. Each act of disobedience, whether intentional or naive, required careful management, subtle correction, and in some cases, secrecy to prevent wider panic or exposure. Some historians suggest that these internal tensions were an inevitable consequence of the Templars' dual nature. They were both warriors and custodians, bound by oaths of obedience yet entrusted with knowledge that elevated them above ordinary men. The greater one's access to sacred relics or forbidden manuscripts, the greater the responsibility, and the greater the temptation to misuse them. Human flaws, pride, curiosity, ambition, fear, were magnified in this context, transforming ordinary mistakes into potentially catastrophic breaches. The order's genius lay not in the absence of conflict, but in its systems for managing it, balancing discipline with secrecy, loyalty with discernment, and obedience with moral judgment. The first betrayals also planted seeds of future tragedy. Small fissures in trust grew over time, setting the stage for larger conflicts that would later engulf the order. Some knights began to question the wisdom of leadership, to interpret oaths in ways that served personal agendas, and to subtly challenge the decisions of their superiors. Others became overly zealous, reporting minor infractions as major betrayals, creating a climate of suspicion that threatened cohesion. These dynamics, almost invisible at first, gradually shaped the internal politics of the Templars, influencing decisions about who could be entrusted with relics, who could access manuscripts, and who was capable of carrying the weight of Solomon's secret legacy. And yet, despite these early signs of discontent, the order continued to thrive. Their military successes, their meticulous preservation of sacred knowledge, and their careful cultivation of alliances allowed them to maintain cohesion even in the face of internal tension. The first betrayals, though subtle, were absorbed into the fabric of the order, shaping protocols, initiation rites, and the careful balance of trust that would define the Templars for decades to come. It was a delicate equilibrium. One misstep could unravel centuries of wisdom, yet the order endured, a testament both to the discipline of its members and to the enduring power of the secrets they safeguarded. In reflecting on these early betrayals, one begins to understand the human element behind the Templars' legend. Their greatest challenge was never solely external. It was the constant negotiation with their own flaws, the struggle to uphold ideals while bearing the burden of knowledge too powerful to wield recklessly. In this tension, between loyalty and ambition, secrecy and curiosity, devotion and human desire, the Templars' true story emerges. A story not only of battlefields and crusades but of internal trials, of moral courage, and of the fragile, often perilous path of those chosen to guard the secrets of history. Even as the Templars rose to power across Europe and the Holy Land, their greatest weapons were not always forged of steel. Some of their most potent influence lay hidden in plain sight, encoded within symbols, architecture, and manuscripts that seemed innocuous to the untrained eye. To the casual observer, a cross carved into a pillar, a geometric pattern etched into a floor, or an inscription in an ancient text might appear as mere decoration or devotion. Yet for the initiated, each mark was a signpost, a key, a message carrying meaning across time, invisible to all but those trained to interpret it. The Templars had inherited not just relics and manuscripts from the hidden brotherhoods before them, but the knowledge of how to convey secrets subtly, so that truth could survive even when its guardians were imperiled. Their fortresses and chapels were particularly revealing to those who knew how to look. Architectural features were designed not only for function or defense but to encode hidden knowledge. Pillars aligned to celestial events, doorways positioned according to sacred geometry, and floor mosaics patterned in ways that reflected philosophical principles. All were carefully orchestrated. The placement of rooms, staircases, and chambers sometimes followed mathematical ratios that echoed the teachings of the Temple of Solomon. Some chambers were deliberately left blank or disguised as storage spaces, serving as protective layers around knowledge too precious to be left exposed. The Templars' buildings, in this sense, were themselves texts, monuments inscribed not in ink but in stone, carrying messages across centuries. Symbols carved into these structures were often cryptic. The cross, the most obvious, was layered with meaning beyond religious devotion. Triangles, circles, pentagrams, and other geometric motifs appeared repeatedly, each chosen for its mathematical, mystical, or philosophical significance. Scholars and chroniclers of later centuries would marvel at the precision and recurrence of these forms, speculating endlessly about their purpose. Some suggest that they encoded instructions for meditation, alignment with celestial patterns, or calculations related to time and navigation. Others posit that the symbols were a form of ethical or moral guidance, a way to instruct the initiated in the principles of conduct, loyalty, and vigilance that defined the Templar mission. Manuscripts provided another layer of hidden communication. Many were written in languages, ciphers, or codes known only to a select few within the order. The texts themselves often contained multiple layers of meaning, readable differently depending on the level of initiation or the contextual knowledge of the reader. Marginal notes might offer one interpretation, while the main body of the text concealed another. Occasionally, symbols were embedded within the text itself, mathematical sequences, star charts, or diagrammatic instructions for constructing sacred geometry. For the uninitiated, these manuscripts were beautiful but meaningless. For those trained in the secret arts, they were maps to knowledge, guides to understanding both the cosmos and the hidden currents of history. The use of such codes and symbols was not merely academic or decorative. They were practical, serving as safeguards to ensure that knowledge remained protected even in times of threat. When enemies encroached or political tides shifted, the Templars could obscure their most valuable teachings in ways that made them effectively invisible. A pattern on a floor could direct the initiated to a hidden chamber. A combination of inscriptions could reveal the location of a manuscript or relic. These were methods honed over generations, inherited from the older brotherhoods that had survived centuries of upheaval. To decode them required not only intelligence but discernment, intuition, and years of careful study. Knowledge was never given freely. It was earned, tested, and guarded with vigilance. Even small objects carried messages. Rings, pendants, and ceremonial tools might bear inscriptions that looked ordinary, yet for those in the know, they signaled allegiance, conveyed warnings, or offered subtle guidance. A simple design might mark the bearer as trusted, indicate a secret meeting place, or even encode directions to a hidden cache. These objects functioned as both identification and communication, a portable form of knowledge that could survive journeys, wars, and sieges. Their existence reinforced a simple principle. The world might be hostile to secrets, but secrets could survive if concealed in plain sight, woven into the fabric of ordinary life. The notion of secrets in plain sight extended beyond symbols and artifacts to the very conduct of the order. Rituals, ceremonies, and daily routines often had dual meanings. On the surface, they were expressions of piety, discipline, or communal cohesion. Beneath the surface, they were exercises in training perception, memory, and ethical judgment. The way a knight carried himself, the path he followed within a fortress, or the steps of a ceremonial procession could all communicate information about rank, trustworthiness, or readiness for initiation into deeper mysteries. Every action, observed carefully, could serve as both instruction and signal, reinforcing the idea that knowledge could be preserved without ever being openly declared. This method of concealment was not arbitrary. The Templars had learned from history that knowledge could be as dangerous as any weapon. Secrets misused could destroy faith, topple governments, or lead to ruin. By encoding information into symbols, architecture, and ritual, they ensured that only those prepared for the responsibility could access the truth. Moreover, it created a form of continuity, allowing generations of Templars to pass knowledge forward even when manuscripts were lost, leaders were imprisoned, or fortresses were attacked. The truth could survive because it was hidden within layers designed to endure the passage of time and the scrutiny of the uninitiated. Whispers of these hidden messages reached even the uninitiated, often misinterpreted or exaggerated. Tales of Templar treasures, secret codes, and mystical powers circulated in courts, villages, and cities, fueling both fascination and fear. Some considered the knights sorcerers or alchemists. Others imagined them as prophets or seers. While most of these stories were exaggerations, they contained a kernel of truth. The Templars' influence extended beyond battlefields, into the realm of hidden wisdom, symbols, and encoded knowledge. Those who sought power, knowledge, or favor often had to navigate a landscape of uncertainty, never fully able to discern what was true, what was symbolic, and what was deliberately concealed. The greatest irony of the Templars' secretive methods was that they were often hidden in the most visible places. A grand chapel, a decorated hall, or a bustling fortress could conceal layers of meaning that only the careful observer would detect. The more ordinary or mundane the setting appeared, the more effective the concealment. Symbols, codes, and patterns functioned like a language with multiple dialects. One for the public, one for the semi-initiated, and one for those entrusted with the highest truths. This stratification ensured that knowledge survived even when the outer world believed it had been vanquished or overlooked. Ultimately, the Templars' use of hidden codes and symbols was both practical and philosophical. It demonstrated an understanding that the visible world was only a fraction of reality, that influence and power often lay in the unseen, and that wisdom could be preserved through careful design, observation, and patience. The marks, inscriptions, and coded manuscripts were not simply tools. They were lessons, tests, and guides designed to train perception, inspire inquiry, and reward those with the discernment to follow the hidden path. In this way, the Order's secrecy became a language, a legacy, and a shield, a testament to the enduring power of knowledge hidden in plain sight. To this day, the remnants of these symbols, codes, and hidden patterns continue to fascinate scholars, adventurers, and seekers of the mysterious. Architectural echoes, cryptic inscriptions, and obscure manuscripts hint at a world of understanding carefully safeguarded for centuries. The Templars' genius was not only in their martial skill or religious devotion, but in their mastery of concealment and subtle communication. Their secrets survive because they were never merely written or spoken. They were encoded into the very fabric of their existence, into stone, parchment, and ritual, a testament to the invisible currents that shaped both their world and the world to come. While the Templars moved through the world cloaked in discipline, secrecy, and sacred purpose, shadows gathered around them. They were not only warriors and custodians of knowledge, but also a source of envy, suspicion, and fear. Across Europe, kings and nobles observed their growing influence with a mixture of admiration and dread. The Templars' military prowess was formidable. Their treasuries were unmatched. Their networks stretched across kingdoms, towns, and even distant lands of the Levant. And yet, it was their hidden power, the secrets they guarded, and the aura of mystery surrounding their rituals and symbols that most unnerved those in authority. To some, the knights were faithful servants of God. To others, they were dangerous intermediaries between heaven and earth, wielding knowledge and influence beyond comprehension. The Church, which had once sanctioned and nurtured the order, began to view the Templars with suspicion. Their allegiance was to the Pope, Yet their autonomy allowed them to operate in ways that sometimes contradicted local clergy, bishops, and even the monarchs who relied on their service. Reports trickled back to Rome of unusual ceremonies, secret meetings, and rituals that seemed to extend beyond conventional religious practice. Chroniclers described the knights as disciplined and devout, yet there were always whispers. Strange symbols carved into fortresses, manuscripts coded in obscure languages, and relics whose provenance was both ancient and mysterious. For the Church, this was an unsettling combination, a reminder that the Templars might be preserving knowledge not meant for human eyes, or at least not meant for all eyes. Kings and rulers, too, felt the weight of the Templars' influence. Monarchs depended on them for military strength, for protection of pilgrims, and for logistical mastery during the Crusades. Yet the Templars' power often exceeded that of vassals or even high-ranking advisors. Their financial networks allowed them to lend money, secure resources, and fund campaigns independently of royal treasuries. Castles under their control were fortified to such an extent that even kings could not command their full might without negotiation or consent. It was an uncomfortable reality. The Templars were both indispensable and potentially uncontrollable. To the wary ruler, they were a force that needed to be monitored, contained, or, if necessary, dismantled. Rival military orders also contributed to the growing tension. The Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, and other groups operating in the same theaters of war often found themselves in competition for prestige, influence, and resources. While many of these orders shared the same faith, the Templars' unique combination of martial skill, organizational acumen, and possession of mysterious knowledge set them apart. Allies became wary competitors, and what began as cooperation in the name of the Crusades sometimes shifted into rivalry, subtle espionage, and attempts to undermine the order. Each victory, each fortress acquired, each new ally gained, brought not only advancement but the seeds of resentment and suspicion that could one day erupt in betrayal. In addition to envy, fear began to spread, fear of the unknown, fear of power that could not be measured or fully understood. Rumors of Templar rituals, relics, and manuscripts circulated through cities and courts, often exaggerated, often deliberately distorted by those who sought to diminish their influence. Tales told of secret ceremonies conducted under the cover of night, of knowledge so profound it could destabilize kingdoms, of relics that could sway the outcome of battles or reveal forbidden truths. Even if these stories were partly imagined, they served a purpose. They painted the Templars as a group that operated beyond ordinary law, beyond ordinary morality, and beyond ordinary comprehension. Fear of what they might know, and what they might choose to reveal, became a powerful tool for their enemies. The political landscape of medieval Europe was itself a minefield. Kings, queens, and barons constantly jostled for power, territory, and influence, often at the expense of the Church, other monarchs, or rival factions. In this volatile environment, the Templars' neutrality, autonomy, and access to secret knowledge became a double-edged sword. Allies relied upon them, yet their influence inspired distrust. Their loyalty was respected, yet their independence threatened the delicate balance of power. Observers noted that the Templars could act as kingmakers, whether intentionally or inadvertently, through the information and resources they controlled. For rulers, this was both an asset and a liability, an order capable of tipping the scales in war or politics, yet almost impossible to fully command. The Templars' growing wealth further complicated matters. Their financial networks extended across Europe and the Levant, allowing them to move money, lend funds, and manage estates in ways that rivaled the most powerful kingdoms. Kings often depended upon them for loans to fund campaigns, repay debts, or secure political alliances. Yet this dependency bred resentment. Some monarchs began to view the order not as loyal servants of the faith, but as independent agents wielding power that could rival their own. The combination of military might, financial control, and secret knowledge made the Templars appear almost untouchable, an untouchability that stoked fear, envy, and suspicion alike. It is perhaps this mixture of visibility and concealment that proved most threatening. The Templars were everywhere, yet in reality, their most potent influence lay in what could not be seen. Their victories were celebrated, their fortresses admired, Yet their rituals, coded manuscripts, and hidden chambers were invisible to outsiders. Power, in its most dangerous form, is not always displayed openly. It is often exercised subtly through knowledge, strategy, and influence. And this was exactly what the Templars embodied, an order whose visible triumphs masked a deeper, far more potent current of authority. Whispers of heresy and corruption began to emerge. Some feared the order had become too secretive, too independent, too powerful. Tales circulated of unorthodox ceremonies, of blasphemous oaths, of acts that defied church orthodoxy. Chroniclers who were not privy to the inner workings of the order often misinterpreted symbols, gestures, or rituals, framing them as evidence of evil intent. Whether accurate or distorted, these stories took hold in the imagination of rulers and clergy alike. Fear, once ignited, is difficult to extinguish, and the more the Templars' influence grew, the more their enemies sought a pretext to challenge, restrict, or ultimately destroy them. By the early 14th century, the stage was set. Kings who once relied on the Templars saw them as a threat. Church officials who had once supported them now questioned their loyalty. Rival orders and factions spread rumors of corruption and heresy. The Knights' treasures, secrets, and coded knowledge, once a source of strength, became a point of vulnerability. The very qualities that had made the order extraordinary, discipline, secrecy, wisdom, and independence, were now exploited by those seeking to dismantle them. It was a paradox that would culminate in dramatic arrests, trials, and executions, events that would forever intertwine fear, ambition, and the power of secrets hidden in plain sight. The Templars, for all their foresight and discipline, were not prepared for the convergence of envy, fear, and political calculation that would descend upon them. They had built an empire of knowledge, influence, and wealth, yet they were still mortal, subject to the intrigues of kings and the politics of the church. Their enemies understood one immutable truth. Knowledge, when concentrated in the hands of a few, is both a tool and a threat. By painting the Templars as heretics, traitors, and manipulators, the stage was set for their fall, a dramatic betrayal that would echo through history. And so, the Knights moved through a world both visible and invisible, admired and feared, respected and distrusted. Their enemies were many, ranging from jealous monarchs to rival military orders to wary clerics. Yet even as threats mounted, the Templars remained steadfast, guarding not only their treasures and fortresses but the lineage of knowledge they had inherited from the hidden brotherhoods, the secrets of Solomon's temple, and the lessons of centuries past. Their story, like the symbols they encoded in stone and parchment, was layered and complex, revealing both human ambition and the enduring power of secrets concealed in plain sight. The night the Templars fell was unlike any other in the annals of history, a night cloaked in darkness, fear, and betrayal. Across Europe, from Paris to the distant castles of the Holy Land, an order that had once seemed invincible suddenly found itself under siege, not by swords or armies, but by law, accusation, and treachery. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, in whispered orders carried through candlelit corridors and cobblestone streets. Knights who had sworn eternal loyalty to each other awoke to find the very institutions they had trusted now aligned against them. No warning bells, no overt declaration of war. Only the sense that the ground beneath them had shifted, that the shadows around them carried men whose loyalty had been purchased, coerced, or corrupted. At dawn, the first arrests were made. Knights were dragged from their chambers, summoned under pretense, or seized in the streets, accused of crimes that seemed almost fantastical in their severity. Charges ranged from heresy to blasphemy, from idolatry to sodomy, each carefully crafted to shock, to alienate, and to justify the most brutal punishment imaginable. Some knights were caught mid-prayer, others mid-guard duty, yet all were equally powerless. The law had become a weapon, wielded by those who feared the Templars' influence, their wealth, and the secrets they possessed. The abruptness of the arrests ensured chaos, leaving the order scrambling to comprehend the betrayal and to protect what could still be saved. The scenes in Paris were especially grim. Torches flared against the pre-dawn mist, casting long, trembling shadows over the stone streets as soldiers moved silently but with purpose. The knights, renowned for their discipline, found themselves outmaneuvered not by strategy but by deception. Guards carried lists of names, maps of residences, and orders from the highest authority, the king himself. The arrests were methodical, precise, and merciless, leaving little room for resistance. Whispers spread among those yet free that the charges were exaggerated, fabricated, or entirely false, but in that moment, rumor mattered little. The machinery of accusation and power had already begun its work, and the knights were powerless to intervene. Within the Templar fortresses, fear took hold like a living thing. Halls that had once echoed with solemn ritual and disciplined training now vibrated with tension and uncertainty. Commanders gathered their men in secret chambers, debating whether to resist, flee, or surrender, yet every option seemed fraught with peril. Trust, the foundation of the order, had been shattered by a network of espionage, bribery, and political calculation. Allies became uncertain, correspondence was intercepted, and even those who had been loyal for decades found themselves questioning the motives of those around them. The enemy was not only external, it had penetrated the order itself, exploiting fear, suspicion, and human frailty to achieve its ends. The charges leveled against the Templars were as theatrical as they were damning. Witnesses were coerced, confessions were extracted under threat or torture, and the most obscure symbols and rituals were twisted into evidence of blasphemy. Practices that had been intended to preserve knowledge or test moral fortitude were recast as heretical rites. Initiation ceremonies, once solemn and sacred, were portrayed as obscene, corrupt, and dangerous. The accusations were designed to shock the public imagination, to tarnish the order's reputation, and to provide moral justification for the arrests and executions that were soon to follow. The Templars, who had operated in secrecy to protect truth and legacy, found their secrecy weaponized against them, the very practices that safeguarded knowledge now twisted into indictments of sin. For many knights, the psychological torment was as devastating as the physical threat. They had dedicated their lives to a mission of protection, faith, and the preservation of knowledge, yet now they faced imprisonment, interrogation, and, in many cases, torture. The psychological weight of betrayal by kings, monarchs, and even allies compounded the fear. Knights were forced to confront the possibility that centuries of loyalty, courage, and discipline might be rendered meaningless by political expedients and the ambitions of men who feared their influence. The uncertainty of who could be trusted, the realization that allies might be coerced into cooperation with authorities, and the sheer magnitude of the charges created a sense of despair that swept through the order like a relentless tide. Despite the terror, there were those who resisted quietly, attempting to protect their secrets and preserve what could be saved. Manuscripts were hidden, relics concealed, and codes obscured. Some knights acted with remarkable foresight, ensuring that knowledge which had survived centuries of war and upheaval would not vanish entirely. Others attempted to escape, slipping through secret passages, fleeing to distant strongholds, or seeking refuge in sympathetic communities. Yet such efforts were perilous. The mechanisms of state and church were relentless, and the very networks that had enabled the Templars' success, their communication channels, fortresses, and alliances, were now turned against them. The night of arrests was not merely an act of law enforcement. It was a sweeping, calculated strike designed to erase the order, to seize their treasures, and to expose their hidden knowledge to scrutiny or destruction. The human element of fear, loyalty, and courage was vividly apparent during these arrests. Families watched helplessly as fathers, brothers, and sons were taken from their homes. Communities that had once relied on Templar protection were left vulnerable, uncertain whether the order would survive or be crushed entirely. Among the knights themselves, there were moments of extraordinary courage, as men accepted their fate with dignity, shielded others from accusation, or attempted to conceal relics and manuscripts even under the threat of torture. These acts, though small in the scale of history, reflected the enduring strength of a brotherhood bound not only by oaths but by the recognition of a higher purpose. As night fell and the arrests continued, the weight of history pressed down upon the Templars. They were more than men accused. They were guardians of a lineage stretching back to Solomon's Temple, custodians of secrets that could alter the understanding of faith, history, and human endeavor. Those who had been prepared to defend their charges with skill and strategy now faced a far more insidious adversary: the machinery of law, the manipulation of fear, and the calculated will of those who sought to erase the order's influence. Each fortress seized, each knight imprisoned, each manuscript confiscated was a blow not only to the Templars, but to a lineage of knowledge preserved through generations. And yet, even amid terror, whispers of hope persisted. Some believed that the secrets could not be destroyed, that the legacy of the Templars, encoded in symbols, hidden manuscripts, and secret codes, would survive even if the men themselves were silenced. Others held on to the hope that allies might intervene, that sympathetic rulers or clerics could mitigate the worst outcomes, or that the order's most essential knowledge could be concealed from those seeking its destruction. In the midst of betrayal and fear, the possibility of continuity, however fragile, became a lifeline. By the end of the night, the Templars had been irreversibly shaken. Their leadership arrested, their treasures seized, and their reputation tarnished. They faced a future dominated by interrogation, imprisonment, and impending trials. The order's very survival depended not only on strategy but on secrecy, courage, and the resilience of those who still understood the significance of the knowledge they guarded. The night marked the beginning of an end, a turning point in history when human ambition, fear, and political calculation converged to challenge an order that had once seemed invincible. Yet even in the shadow of collapse, the Templars' legacy endured, embedded in the whispers of hidden manuscripts, encoded symbols, and relics carried to safety by those who understood that some knowledge, however perilous, must survive. When the Templar arrests rippled across Europe, it marked the beginning not only of a tragic fall but of a dispersion whose consequences would echo for centuries. Those who survived the initial purge were scattered, forced to vanish into lands far beyond the scrutiny of kings, popes, and inquisitors. Some fled to the windswept coasts of Portugal, where hidden fortresses offered refuge and the secrets of the order could be safeguarded in quiet isolation. Others traveled eastward, weaving through the labyrinthine streets of Mediterranean cities, slipping into the anonymity of bustling markets and cloisters. They were men and women burdened not only by fear but by knowledge, aware that their lives were at stake and that the wisdom they carried was worth more than any coin or crown. In the shadows, these survivors became ghosts, their presence barely perceptible to the world they left behind. Castles that once echoed with the disciplined footsteps of knights now stood empty, yet their secrets were not lost. Manuscripts were hidden behind false walls, in hidden compartments beneath floors, and even buried beneath sacred ground. Relics, too, were concealed, sometimes entrusted to allies who understood the gravity of the order's mission, sometimes buried in remote wilderness, the location known only to a handful of initiates. Each act of preservation was an exercise in both courage and ingenuity, a testament to the Templars' understanding that knowledge, once exposed, could be both a gift and a curse. The dispersal of the order was not merely physical, it was intellectual and spiritual. Those who fled carried with them memories of ceremonies, secret rituals, and encoded teachings, passing them orally or through encrypted manuscripts to trusted disciples. These were not casual lessons. They were fragments of a lineage that stretched back to Solomon's temple itself, knowledge that had been preserved through centuries of conflict and secrecy. Initiates were trained to remember, to encode, and to conceal, ensuring that the wisdom survived even if the physical repositories were lost. Over time, this knowledge would seep into other orders, societies, and clandestine networks, creating a web of influence invisible to the casual historian but potent to those who understood its significance. Some Templars sought refuge in monastic communities, blending in among the devout while subtly preserving the order's heritage. They became scholars, teachers, and advisors, embedding the lessons of their order into architecture, art, and literature, often disguised as theological or philosophical study. Others moved to the courts of sympathetic rulers, where their knowledge of finance, strategy, and sacred tradition proved invaluable. In these positions, they could continue to guide events subtly, influencing outcomes without drawing attention to the remnants of the order that still survived in secrecy. In every case, Survival required adaptability, patience, and the skill to navigate a world now hostile to their existence. The dispersal also fostered a new evolution of secrecy. Where once the order had functioned as a unified body, bound by central authority, the surviving Templars now operated in small, decentralized cells. Each cell was self-sufficient, carrying only the knowledge necessary to continue its mission. Communication between cells was rare, encrypted, and often symbolic. This decentralization, born of necessity, ensured that even if one cell were discovered, the entirety of the Order's legacy could not be eradicated. In this way, the Templars' fall paradoxically strengthened the survival of their knowledge, embedding it more deeply in secrecy, obfuscation, and cunning than ever before. Among these dispersed survivors, a pattern began to emerge. Certain groups moved with a shared purpose, not merely to survive but to safeguard a lineage whose significance extended beyond temporal power. They became custodians of the arcane, preserving manuscripts, relics, and coded knowledge that would later be linked to the Order of Solomon. Their influence, while invisible, was carefully exercised. They sought to shape events indirectly, ensuring that certain truths remained protected while guiding allies, rulers, and even other religious institutions toward decisions that preserved the integrity of what they guarded. This subtle stewardship required patience and foresight, an understanding that history unfolds not only in visible battles, but in the quiet choices of those who remain unseen. It was during this period that myths and rumors began to intertwine with reality. Chroniclers recorded sightings of mysterious knights who moved like shadows, scholars who carried forbidden knowledge, and groups that appeared to operate outside the bounds of traditional authority. These accounts were fragmentary, often contradictory, but they shared a consistent theme. The Templars had not disappeared entirely. They had evolved into something more elusive, their presence both subtle and profound. In the stories of these wandering guardians, the seeds of the Order of Solomon began to take root, a network dedicated not only to faith and protection but to the preservation of knowledge older and more powerful than any empire. Some of the surviving Templars sought refuge in distant lands entirely removed from Europe's political machinations. North Africa, the islands of the Mediterranean, and even the reaches of the Middle East became sanctuaries. In these regions, the exiled knights could operate with relative freedom, continuing their studies, rituals, and preservation of sacred texts. Their presence in foreign lands allowed for the transmission of knowledge across cultures, subtly influencing local rulers, scholars, and architects. Manuscripts hidden in these regions sometimes resurfaced centuries later, hinting at a lineage that had survived political collapse and geographic dislocation, preserving insights that bridged East and West, past and present. Despite the dispersal, the moral and emotional weight of failure was immense. Knights who had sworn oaths of loyalty found themselves questioning the nature of justice, authority, and divine will. Some endured imprisonment and torture, emerging physically scarred and spiritually wary, yet still committed to the mission they had inherited. Others grappled with despair, realizing that centuries of careful stewardship could not prevent the sudden dismantling of their order. Yet even in the darkest moments, a determination persisted. Knowledge and truth were worth any personal sacrifice, and the preservation of these secrets was paramount, even if it required vanishing from sight and allowing history to believe the Templars had been extinguished entirely. It is in this vacuum that the concept of a new, hidden brotherhood begins to emerge. Those who survived the purge carried forward fragments of the Templar mission, merging it with older lineages that traced back to the custodians of Solomon's temple. This embryonic Order of Solomon, though lacking formal structure at first, functioned as a spiritual and intellectual continuation of the Templars' purpose. Its members operated in secrecy, preserving knowledge, influencing events subtly, and ensuring that the legacy of sacred wisdom would not be lost. The very act of dispersal, forced by persecution, created the conditions for a more flexible and enduring network, one capable of surviving centuries of political upheaval and human ambition. Whispers of these hidden movements would persist over generations, giving rise to stories that straddled the line between history and myth. Travelers, scholars, and chroniclers occasionally caught glimpses of mysterious figures or secret gatherings, but these were fleeting, difficult to verify, and often dismissed as legend. Yet each account contained threads of continuity, a commitment to safeguarding ancient wisdom, a network of hidden initiates, and a philosophy that elevated knowledge, secrecy, and moral responsibility above power or wealth. From these fragments, the Order of Solomon slowly crystallized, its existence hinted at in cryptic manuscripts, obscure architecture, and clandestine traditions that persisted across centuries. In retrospect, the dispersal of the Templars can be seen as both catastrophe and opportunity. The order, once centralized and therefore vulnerable, was shattered, its knights scattered and its treasures seized. Yet from this destruction arose a more resilient form of guardianship, one that relied on secrecy, adaptability, and subtle influence. The surviving Templars became the architects of a hidden lineage, ensuring that the wisdom of Solomon's temple, combined with the esoteric teachings of the medieval order, would endure even when history sought to erase it. Their mission was no longer bound to castles or courts but to the quiet preservation of truth, a mission that would eventually manifest as the enigmatic and enduring Order of Solomon. From the ashes of the Templars' abrupt fall, a new form of clandestine organization began to take shape, one that would move through history with deliberate invisibility and quiet influence. This was the emergence of the Order of Solomon, a brotherhood that drew upon the scattered remnants of the Templars, the hidden lineages of the ancient custodians, and the knowledge preserved through centuries of secrecy. Unlike its predecessors, this order did not seek public acclaim or visible authority. It operated as a shadow within history, guiding events, preserving sacred knowledge, and shaping the world from behind veils of anonymity. Its members understood that true power did not need recognition. It needed patience, discretion, and a deep commitment to guarding the wisdom of the ages. The formation of this hidden brotherhood was neither rapid nor uniform. Survivors of the Templar Purge carried fragments of knowledge, relics, and manuscripts, but they were dispersed, isolated, and pursued by enemies who sought to annihilate every trace of their order. To consolidate these remnants required patience, cunning, and trust. Small groups formed in remote locations, hidden chapels in the hills of France, secluded monasteries in Portugal, and obscure estates across the Mediterranean. Each group preserved knowledge independently, ensuring that even if one cell were discovered, the entirety of the legacy could survive. Over time, these disparate factions began to recognize their shared purpose, slowly weaving a web that would become the foundation of the Order of Solomon. Central to the emergence of the Brotherhood was the understanding that history itself could be a tool. Members of the order studied political currents, religious movements, and economic networks with meticulous care. They observed the ambitions of kings, the intrigues of courts, and the agendas of the church, seeking opportunities to influence events subtly, always without revealing themselves. In this sense, the Order of Solomon functioned not only as a guardian of knowledge but as an architect of destiny, using foresight, strategy, and discretion to shape outcomes that aligned with the preservation of wisdom. The lessons of the Templars had been clear. Knowledge unprotected or misused could be catastrophic, so influence had to be exercised with subtlety, and decisions had to be guided by ethical discernment as much as by practical calculation. The Brotherhood maintained an air of ritual and symbolism reminiscent of its predecessors. Initiations, though secret and simplified, preserved the essence of what had been learned from the Templars and the ancient custodians before them. Each new member was carefully assessed for loyalty, intelligence, and moral fortitude. Scrolls and manuscripts were introduced incrementally, often encoded with layers of meaning that could only be deciphered through study and guidance. Rituals served both as tests and as methods of transmission, reinforcing discipline, focus, and the capacity to perceive hidden truths. In this way, the order safeguarded its intellectual and spiritual inheritance, ensuring that each generation understood not only the content of the knowledge they protected but also the responsibility it carried. The Order of Solomon also developed a philosophy of subtle influence, understanding that history was shaped as much by whispers and guidance as by open confrontation. They cultivated relationships with scholars, advisors, and rulers, offering counsel that appeared impartial or coincidental, but which often carried layers of strategic intent. In some cases, they provided resources, protection, or expertise to ensure that decisions aligned with the preservation of knowledge and the safeguarding of sacred relics. Unlike the Templars, who wielded military and financial power openly, the Order of Solomon mastered the art of invisible intervention, shaping outcomes without drawing attention to themselves. Their influence was designed to be imperceptible, leaving no trace except in the subtle shifts of history that would later puzzle observers. Some members of the emerging order were drawn from nobility, clergy, or scholars who had once been affiliated with the Templars or other secretive brotherhoods. These individuals brought with them not only knowledge but networks of influence and access to resources. Others were ordinary men and women, recruited for their intellect, intuition, and discretion. Each member understood that visibility was dangerous, that arrogance or recklessness could endanger the entire network. Loyalty and secrecy were paramount, and even within the Brotherhood, only a select few were entrusted with the deepest layers of knowledge, including manuscripts, relics, and the principles guiding their stewardship. The Order's influence extended across both time and geography. Its members moved discreetly through courts and cities, monasteries and universities, preserving manuscripts, advising rulers, and ensuring that relics remained hidden from those who would exploit or destroy them. They left no formal record of their existence. Their deeds were preserved only in subtle shifts in decisions, protected archives, and the occasional coded document. This approach allowed them to endure centuries of political upheaval, religious reform, and warfare. Even as kingdoms rose and fell, as empires expanded and collapsed, the Order of Solomon persisted, moving like a silent current beneath the surface of history. There are tantalizing hints that the Order may have influenced key historical events, though these remain speculative and often veiled in allegory. Some scholars suggest that advisors linked to the Brotherhood may have guided monarchs, shaped treaties, or even influenced battles, always subtly, always indirectly. Others point to the preservation of certain manuscripts, maps, and relics as evidence of a long-term strategy designed to maintain access to ancient knowledge. What is clear is that the Order operated on a principle that what survived was not only tangible wealth or military might, but the wisdom that could endure centuries and shape civilizations. Symbols and architecture remained central to the Brotherhood's methods. Just as the Templars had encoded knowledge in fortresses and manuscripts, the Order of Solomon employed symbols that could be understood only by those initiated into their philosophy. In monasteries, cathedrals, and even private estates, hidden signs, geometric patterns, and coded inscriptions were left as markers and guides for those trained to read them. These symbols served as both instruction and protection, ensuring that knowledge could be passed safely and that outsiders would remain unaware of its significance. Through this system, the Order created a continuity of purpose that spanned generations and continents. The emotional weight of this work was profound. Members of the Order carried the responsibility of centuries of knowledge, aware that mistakes could result in the permanent loss of wisdom or even in danger to the wider world. The burden was intensified by the Order's secrecy. Their sacrifices were invisible, their contributions unrecognized, and their failures known only to themselves. Yet this very burden reinforced their dedication. To serve the Order was to accept that one's life, actions, and even identity might remain hidden, all in service of a mission that transcended personal glory or temporal reward. As the Order of Solomon solidified its structure and philosophy, it became clear that its mission was not static. It was a living legacy, adapting to the changing world while preserving the core principles inherited from the Templars and the custodians of Solomon's Temple. Its members understood that history is neither linear nor predictable. Therefore, the preservation of knowledge required flexibility, foresight, and the subtle exercise of influence. In essence, the Order was both a guardian and a guide, a network of silent architects shaping the course of civilization from shadows, ensuring that the most important truths would endure even when the world believed them lost. Through careful study, patient preservation, and discreet intervention, the Order of Solomon emerged as one of history's most enigmatic networks. Its members were the inheritors of a lineage that stretched back to the construction of Solomon's Temple, to the hidden brotherhoods that had preceded the Templars, and to the survivors who had dispersed after the Purge. They were warriors, scholars, and custodians, bound by secrecy, loyalty, and the conviction that knowledge must be preserved above all else. Though the world may have been unaware of their presence, their influence quietly shaped events, guided decisions, and safeguarded treasures both material and intellectual, creating a legacy that would endure far longer than any kingdom or empire. The Order of Solomon was, above all else, a sanctuary for knowledge, a hidden bastion in a world that often feared what it could not control. Its members understood that wisdom, once revealed indiscriminately, could be as dangerous as any weapon, capable of destabilizing faith, politics, or even the very understanding of reality itself. From the moment they emerged from the shadows of the Templars, the Order dedicated itself to the preservation of this knowledge, carefully safeguarding manuscripts, relics, and traditions that had survived centuries of war, exile, and persecution. Each member who was initiated carried not only the technical skills necessary to maintain these treasures, but a deep awareness of their moral and spiritual responsibility. To hold the secrets of Solomon's legacy was to bear a burden heavier than gold, heavier even than a sword in battle. The texts preserved by the Order were unlike those found in any public library. Some contained esoteric mathematics, geometric formulas designed to harmonize architecture with the cosmos, or detailed descriptions of astronomical cycles that guided not only religious festivals but also strategic decisions in politics and warfare. Others were philosophical treatises exploring the relationship between human will and divine order, instructions for meditation and ritual, or cryptic annotations on moral and ethical conduct. Every manuscript was layered with meaning, often intentionally coded to ensure that only those trained in interpretation could comprehend its full significance. A single symbol, a subtle variation in line or shape, could transform the understanding of an entire page, rendering knowledge invisible to anyone uninitiated. Relics held equal, if not greater, significance. Objects once housed in sacred temples, including fragments believed to be connected to Solomon's temple, were carefully concealed within the Order's secret chambers. Each relic carried multiple layers of meaning: historical, spiritual, and practical. Some were believed to amplify perception, sharpen intuition, or reveal hidden patterns in nature and human behavior. Others served as physical representations of philosophical or mathematical principles, teaching through their form, alignment, or placement. To mishandle one of these objects was to risk more than personal disgrace. It was to jeopardize centuries of careful preservation and the stability of the knowledge entrusted to the Order. The Order's guardians understood that knowledge was not merely for contemplation. It was a tool for shaping understanding and guiding action. Certain manuscripts contained principles that could influence political decisions, guide military strategy, or reveal hidden connections between distant events. The careful study of these texts allowed members of the Order to foresee potential consequences and intervene subtly, nudging events toward outcomes that would protect the wisdom they preserved. This influence was never overt. It was exercised like the current beneath a river, unseen, felt only in its effects. The Order of Solomon operated in this way for centuries, shaping the world without ever revealing its hand. Some of the knowledge preserved by the Order was dangerous precisely because it was powerful. Certain texts and relics described phenomena that, if misused, could be catastrophic. Detailed studies of optics, acoustics, and celestial mechanics were interwoven with mystical instructions, creating practices that blurred the line between science, art, and ritual. Knowledge of natural forces, when applied with precision, could yield insights far beyond ordinary comprehension. But when applied recklessly, the results could be destructive. The Order's members were acutely aware that the ethical use of knowledge was as critical as its preservation. To be a guardian was to exercise restraint, judgment, and an unwavering commitment to the greater good. Ritual played a central role in the Order's work. Initiates were trained not only in the practical applications of knowledge but in the spiritual and moral disciplines that ensured they could wield it responsibly. Ceremonies, often conducted in secret chambers or remote sanctuaries, served multiple purposes. They reinforced discipline, transmitted coded teachings, and tested character. Novices were guided through complex sequences of symbolic actions, meditations, and instructions that demanded both intellectual rigor and ethical discernment. The lessons were designed to be absorbed slowly, over months or even years, ensuring that knowledge was not simply learned but internalized, forming the foundation for responsible action in the future. The ethical weight of the Order's mission cannot be overstated. Unlike institutions bound by law or politics, the Order of Solomon operated according to principles that transcended temporal authority. The preservation of knowledge was a sacred duty, and the potential consequences of its misuse were catastrophic. Members understood that one careless act could expose secrets to enemies, destabilize alliances, or even cause the collapse of systems built upon centuries of trust and subtle influence. Every decision, every action, and every teaching was filtered through this ethical lens. In this way, the Order cultivated not only wisdom but a profound sense of moral responsibility, a recognition that guardianship was inseparable from virtue. The training of new members reflected this dual emphasis on skill and ethics. Apprentices were introduced gradually to manuscripts, relics, and rituals, always under the supervision of experienced mentors. Errors were corrected discreetly, interpretations were debated, and understanding was tested through both thought and action. The goal was to create guardians capable not only of preserving knowledge but of applying it wisely, of navigating the complex interplay between power, secrecy, and morality. Those who failed to meet these standards were often removed quietly, their path redirected to ensure that the integrity of the Order remained uncompromised. The preservation of forbidden sciences was particularly delicate. The Order safeguarded knowledge that spanned multiple disciplines: astronomy, geometry, natural philosophy, and early alchemical practices, interwoven with mystical and symbolic understanding. This was knowledge that, if exposed, could provoke fear, misinterpretation, or even persecution. By encoding teachings in manuscripts, symbols, and rituals, the Order ensured that only those who had proven themselves capable could access them. This method of layered instruction was a hallmark of their approach. Knowledge existed in multiple dimensions, comprehensible at varying levels depending on training, experience, and discernment. The Order of Solomon also understood the importance of adaptability. Knowledge preserved across centuries could lose relevance if the world changed in ways that the original custodians had not foreseen. Therefore, they developed methods to interpret and apply wisdom flexibly, ensuring its survival and effectiveness across shifting political, cultural, and intellectual landscapes. They were not simply archivists. They were active custodians, capable of anticipating challenges, adapting strategies, and subtly guiding events to protect the integrity of the knowledge in their care. The human dimension of their work was profound. Each member was acutely aware that their actions or inactions had consequences that could resonate across generations. The weight of responsibility was both a source of strength and a source of tension, demanding unwavering commitment to secrecy, integrity, and vigilance. Relationships within the Order were built on trust, discipline, and shared purpose. Even minor lapses in judgment could endanger the network, making every decision, every communication, and every action a test of character and loyalty. Ultimately, the Order of Solomon was defined by its stewardship of knowledge as much as by any external action. It existed in the shadows not for personal gain or ambition, but to ensure that the wisdom of ages survived the storms of history. It was a lineage of guardians, a living continuation of the Templars' mission, and a bridge to the hidden legacies of Solomon's Temple. Their work was invisible to the world, yet its effects were profound, influencing events, preserving insight, and maintaining continuity across centuries. To be a member was to accept a life of duty, secrecy, and ethical rigor, to carry the weight of knowledge that could shape the world, and to recognize that true power often lies not in its display, but in its careful moral preservation. The Order of Solomon, though hidden from public view, understood the necessity of influence. Knowledge alone was not enough. It had to be preserved, protected, and, when necessary, subtly directed into the right hands. Over centuries, the Order developed a network of cryptic alliances, forging relationships with monarchs, scholars, and advisors whose decisions could shape the course of nations. These alliances were never formalized, never recorded in official registers or treaties. Instead, they existed in whispers, in discreet correspondences, in gestures and gifts whose meanings were understood only by those attuned to the Order's hidden language. Through these bonds, the Brotherhood exerted influence without drawing attention to itself, a silent force guiding the currents of history. The selection of allies was meticulous. Those chosen were not simply powerful or wealthy. They had to be perceptive, discreet, and capable of interpreting subtle guidance. Kings, queens, and princes who were aware of the Order's existence were often intrigued by the opportunity to access wisdom not publicly available. Scholars and clerics, meanwhile, were valued for their intellectual acumen, their ability to safeguard knowledge, and their potential to transmit it responsibly. Each alliance was built on mutual benefit and deep trust. The Order of Solomon provided insight, protection, and access to hidden resources, while the ally offered sanctuary, influence, or the capacity to preserve the Order's secrets in an uncertain world. Communication within these alliances was layered with subtlety. Letters, gifts, and even architecture conveyed messages that might seem mundane to an outsider but carried significant meaning to those initiated into the Order's methods. A commissioned manuscript could encode directions, principles, or warnings. The design of a palace or cathedral could signal support or convey philosophical instruction. These methods ensured that the Order's influence could extend over long distances and across generations without exposing itself to danger. Its members had learned from the Templars' downfall that visibility could be fatal, and so they mastered the art of remaining indispensable yet invisible. Some of the Order's most significant alliances were forged with rulers who sought guidance on matters of war, diplomacy, or governance. While history records the decisions and battles of kings, it rarely reveals the advisors who shaped those choices from the shadows. It is here that the Order of Solomon's influence becomes compelling. The ability to direct outcomes subtly, ensuring that events unfolded in ways that protected the preservation of knowledge and sacred relics, while maintaining the appearance of autonomy for the rulers themselves. These interventions were deliberate, carefully calculated, and always invisible to the uninitiated. The Order understood that true influence is not exerted by force alone, but by guiding perception and shaping decisions in ways that appear natural to those being influenced. The alliances were not purely pragmatic. They were also philosophical and spiritual. The Order sought allies who would respect the sanctity of the knowledge it preserved, who would act ethically even when unaware of the full significance of the guidance they received. Scholars, clerics, and rulers who fell within this circle were often subtly tested, assessed for their loyalty, judgment, and discretion. Those who failed were quietly excluded, while those who demonstrated aptitude were entrusted with further insights, sometimes indirectly influencing events or preserving texts, manuscripts, and relics critical to the Order's mission. In this way, the Order of Solomon cultivated a network of guardians and influencers whose impact could be felt across both political and intellectual spheres. Sometimes, these alliances extended into the financial and commercial realms. Members of the Order occasionally engaged with banking networks, merchants, and patrons who could provide resources to safeguard relics, maintain hidden libraries, or fund scholarly endeavors. These relationships were often cloaked in legitimate business, trade, or sponsorship, yet they enabled the Order to sustain its mission even in times of political instability or persecution. The careful management of resources ensured that treasures, both material and intellectual, remained protected, accessible only to those prepared to honor their legacy. Wealth, in the hands of the Order, was not an end but a means, a tool to preserve knowledge and safeguard continuity. Rulers and advisors sometimes sought the Order's guidance without fully understanding its purpose. They recognized the strategic value of information, the insight provided by subtle counsel, and the wisdom of a hidden hand that could anticipate challenges and mitigate crises. Yet, even when unaware of the deeper intentions, these allies contributed to the survival of the Order's knowledge and influence. Through carefully orchestrated interventions, the Order of Solomon ensured that its mission continued uninterrupted, weaving its objectives seamlessly into the broader tapestry of political and social developments. In this way, the Order became a silent architect of history, guiding outcomes while remaining unseen. The complexity of these alliances also introduced risks. Misinterpretation, betrayal, or shifting political landscapes could expose the Order to danger. To mitigate this, Its members developed rigorous protocols for assessing potential allies, evaluating loyalty, and maintaining plausible deniability. Communication was always coded or symbolic. Knowledge was compartmentalized, shared on a need-to-know basis. The Order's meticulous attention to detail allowed it to maintain influence without compromising its secrecy, a balance that required discipline, foresight, and constant vigilance. Even the slightest error could have catastrophic consequences, yet the Order endured, refining its methods with each passing generation. Some historians speculate that these alliances may have influenced pivotal moments in European and Mediterranean history. Battles, treaties, and political decisions, when examined closely, reveal patterns that suggest the hand of a subtle, guiding force. While direct evidence is scarce, circumstantial details, coincidences, repeated alignments of interest, and preserved manuscripts hinting at strategy suggest that the Order of Solomon's influence was profound. Its members operated with patience, shaping events across decades, ensuring that their mission, the preservation of knowledge, the safeguarding of relics, and the cultivation of ethical stewardship, remained intact despite the turbulence of history. Even as these alliances flourished, the Order maintained its focus on secrecy. Publicly, its members were often indistinguishable from ordinary scholars, advisors, or courtiers. Privately, they were custodians of a legacy that transcended temporal authority, bound by oaths to protect knowledge that predated kingdoms, empires, and even the recorded chronicles of human history. Their alliances were carefully structured to extend influence while maintaining distance, ensuring that their hand could guide without revealing itself. In this way, the Order became both powerful and invisible, a network that shaped history quietly yet decisively. Ultimately, the cryptic alliances forged by the Order of Solomon illustrate a central principle. Influence is most effective when it is invisible, when it operates through subtle channels, and when it is guided by wisdom and ethical responsibility. These alliances allowed the Order to endure through centuries of change, to preserve sacred knowledge, and to safeguard relics whose significance would have been destroyed if exposed prematurely. They demonstrate that history is not shaped solely by visible forces, by kings or armies, but by those who understand the weight of knowledge, the necessity of discretion, and the power of patience. The Order of Solomon's alliances, therefore, were more than political or strategic tools. They were lifelines for the preservation of human understanding. Through carefully cultivated relationships with monarchs, scholars, financiers, and clerics, the Order ensured that the mission inherited from the Templars and the custodians of Solomon's Temple survived. Each alliance was a carefully placed thread in a larger tapestry, a silent yet potent influence guiding history while shielding the knowledge, relics, and wisdom at the heart of the Order's purpose. In this delicate balance between visibility and secrecy, the Order of Solomon exemplified the art of shaping the world without revealing the hands that moved it. While the Great Crusades are etched into the annals of history, there were campaigns, skirmishes, and maneuvers that never fully entered the public record. Conflicts shaped as much by secrecy as by open warfare. These were the so-called Lost Crusades, missions that, on the surface, appeared minor, mismanaged, or inconsequential, but which, when examined through the lens of the Order of Solomon, reveal the subtle hand of an invisible influence. Survivors of the Templar Purge, dispersed and wary, carried with them the strategic knowledge, sacred maps, and encoded instructions necessary to guide battles and secure outcomes that would protect the hidden legacies of the past. While kings and generals claimed credit for victories or consoled themselves with the appearance of defeat, the Order's influence often determined the true course of events. In the Levant, for example, some campaigns unfolded with surprising precision, enabling small forces to achieve outcomes that should have been impossible. Documents preserved by clandestine members of the Order suggest that certain logistical decisions, timing of reinforcements, placement of fortifications, and routes of supply, were informed by calculations and knowledge passed down from ancient custodians of Solomon's Temple. These instructions were often encoded in symbols, maps, or manuscripts that only the initiated could interpret. The public saw armies moving in what appeared to be chaotic, reactive patterns, but in reality, many maneuvers were orchestrated behind the veil, guided by principles of geometry, terrain analysis, and strategic foresight that transcended conventional military wisdom. These lost crusades also involved the protection of relics and knowledge. Certain sites targeted by these campaigns were not chosen for political or religious significance alone. They concealed artifacts, manuscripts, or sacred locations that the order had identified as crucial to preserving its legacy. Knights operating under the banner of the Templars, or in some cases, operating independently while carrying forward their mission, undertook these campaigns with dual objectives: the outward defense of the faithful and the inward safeguarding of secrets. Every engagement, every siege, and every negotiation carried the weight of both tangible and intangible stakes, blending the public and the private, the temporal and the eternal. The coordination required for such operations was immense, especially considering the dispersed nature of the order after the purge. Members relied on encoded messages, symbolic instructions, and carefully concealed alliances to communicate over long distances. Couriers, hidden manuscripts, and coded correspondence ensured that strategic knowledge could be transmitted safely, even when the routes of supply and communication were controlled by outsiders. The subtle orchestration of these campaigns illustrates the order's capacity for both long-term planning and immediate tactical adaptation, a combination of foresight and flexibility that allowed them to protect knowledge while influencing outcomes without drawing attention. Some of the lost crusades, in fact, were intentionally obfuscated from historical records to protect the order's influence and its secrets. Victories or failures were attributed to ordinary generals, political chance, or divine will, masking the hidden guidance that had shaped events. In this way, the order ensured that its influence could persist without exposing itself to the dangers of visibility. Even the chroniclers of the time, working with partial information or misled by deliberate obfuscation, could not discern the invisible hand guiding these campaigns. It was a perfect example of the Order of Solomon's philosophy: shape outcomes, preserve knowledge, and remain unseen, for recognition could be a liability as dangerous as the enemy itself. The moral and ethical considerations of these interventions were profound. Members of the order were acutely aware that even the best-planned campaigns involved human suffering and the chaos of war. Decisions were calculated not only for strategic advantage but to minimize unnecessary destruction, particularly in areas where sacred knowledge or relics were at stake. This delicate balance between intervention and restraint required discernment, patience, and a deep understanding of both human behavior and the consequences of action. Knights and scholars alike carried the burden of these choices, knowing that their guidance could preserve life and wisdom, or, if misapplied, invite catastrophe. In some cases, the Lost Crusades intersected with political maneuvering, where the Order's guidance helped shape alliances, prevent unnecessary conflicts, or redirect attention away from sensitive knowledge. For example, a minor campaign might appear to be a failure or diversion, yet it succeeded in preserving the location of a hidden manuscript, securing the loyalty of a local ruler, or ensuring the safety of a relic. The apparent chaos of these events, recorded by outsiders, masks the deliberate calculation, foresight, and ethical judgment exercised by the Order of Solomon. Their influence was a dance between invisibility and efficacy, a constant negotiation with the unpredictability of human ambition, conflict, and error. Even in Europe, far from the battlefields of the Holy Land, the Order's influence could be discerned in the subtle guidance of feudal lords, city-states, and ecclesiastical authorities. Conflicts that appear minor or tangential in the historical record may have been influenced by discreet counsel, strategic advice, or the careful deployment of resources orchestrated by Order members. Their aim was always consistent: to preserve knowledge, safeguard relics, and ensure that the broader currents of history did not endanger the lineage of wisdom entrusted to them. By intervening indirectly, the Order maintained influence without exposure, leaving outcomes seemingly in the hands of those who believed they acted independently. The psychological dimension of these lost crusades was equally important. Leaders and generals guided by cryptic instructions often perceived insights as divine inspiration, intuitive reasoning, or the result of human experience. In this way, the Order preserved the illusion of autonomy, even as its hidden guidance shaped outcomes in alignment with its mission. The strategic genius embedded in these campaigns was, therefore, a combination of esoteric knowledge, practical skill, and ethical stewardship, ensuring that both visible and invisible objectives were met. Success depended not only on the military acumen of knights and commanders but on their moral judgment and their ability to interpret subtle guidance accurately. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Lost Crusades is their enduring mystery. Many of the battles, sieges, and maneuvers remain poorly documented, misattributed, or hidden in obscure chronicles. Yet the surviving clues, the alignment of fortresses, the timing of reinforcements, and the preservation of key relics suggest the presence of a guiding intelligence operating behind the scenes. The Order of Solomon, inheriting the methods of the Templars and the hidden custodians before them, used these campaigns not only to protect knowledge but to demonstrate the power of subtle, patient, and ethical intervention. History recorded only fragments, yet the invisible architecture of influence can still be discerned by those who look closely. In the end, the Lost Crusades exemplify the dual nature of the Order. Visible action intertwined with invisible guidance, practical strategy coupled with ethical stewardship, and the protection of both lives and knowledge. These campaigns, though often overlooked, reveal a hidden hand shaping events, a network of custodians whose influence was profound precisely because it remained concealed. They illustrate that history is not merely the story of kings and armies, but also the careful work of those who understand the weight of knowledge, the responsibility of power, and the subtle art of shaping outcomes without drawing attention to themselves. Among the most treasured possessions safeguarded by the Order of Solomon were the relics of power, objects whose significance extended far beyond the material or aesthetic. These were not mere symbols of faith or displays of wealth. They were vessels of knowledge, artifacts imbued with history, sacred meaning, and, in some accounts, a metaphysical potency that could influence perception, action, and even destiny itself. The Order inherited these relics from the Templars, who had carried them from the ruins and hidden chambers of Solomon's Temple, and from other secret lineages whose custodianship stretched back centuries. To protect these objects was to protect the continuity of knowledge, a responsibility that demanded vigilance, discretion, and profound ethical awareness. The relics themselves were diverse and enigmatic. Some were ceremonial objects, chalices, ornate rings, amulets, each intricately crafted and encoded with symbolic meaning. They were used in rituals that preserved sacred knowledge, often in conjunction with manuscripts or coded instructions. The form of these objects was deliberate. Geometric patterns, inscriptions, and embedded materials were designed not merely for aesthetic appeal, but to encode information accessible only to the initiated. For example, a simple chalice might bear engravings whose proportions corresponded to celestial alignments, mathematical principles, or esoteric teachings. Understanding these symbols required training, intuition, and moral discipline, for misinterpretation could lead to error or disaster. Other relics were fragments believed to be linked directly to Solomon's Temple, preserved across centuries of conflict, migration, and secrecy. Some contained inscriptions in languages long forgotten or coded in ways that layered multiple levels of meaning. Their significance was often practical as well as spiritual. They might mark the location of hidden manuscripts, guide the construction of sacred architecture, or even indicate the timing of events aligned with celestial cycles. The Order treated these objects with extraordinary care, recognizing that their preservation was inseparable from the survival of wisdom itself. The loss or misuse of a single relic could unravel centuries of careful stewardship and compromise the continuity of knowledge. The ethical dimension of handling these relics was as important as their preservation. The Order of Solomon understood that knowledge is only as responsible as the hands that wield it. Many objects were designed to instruct or guide, but they also carried inherent risks if misused. Ceremonial tools, for instance, could amplify perception or intuition in the trained, but induce confusion or misjudgment in those unprepared. Manuscripts associated with relics often contained codes that could mislead the unwary. The guardians of these objects were therefore not merely caretakers. They were teachers, philosophers, and moral custodians, responsible for ensuring that power and wisdom were exercised with restraint, discernment, and reverence. The relics were also a medium of continuity. Through them, the Order of Solomon maintained an unbroken link to the ancient custodians of Solomon's Temple and the Templars' hidden legacy. Each artifact carried stories, lessons, and encoded principles that had survived sieges, purges, and centuries of change. To study a relic was to engage in a dialogue across generations, connecting the present with the wisdom of the past. Members of the order meticulously documented their observations, using cryptic annotations and symbolic markers to ensure that the essence of knowledge could survive even if the objects themselves were threatened or displaced. In this way, relics were not inert treasures. They were living instruments of preservation, education, and subtle influence. Some relics were reputed to possess extraordinary capabilities, not in a supernatural sense alone, but in their ability to focus attention, inspire insight, or encode complex information. A carefully positioned artifact could guide meditation, facilitate the understanding of complex geometry, or reveal patterns in historical or astronomical data. They were tools of perception, teaching their guardians to see beyond the surface of reality, to recognize hidden patterns, and to act with discernment. The symbolic and practical aspects of these objects were intertwined, reinforcing the order's philosophy that knowledge and morality, power and restraint, insight and action must always be held in balance. The strategic significance of these relics extended beyond their immediate use. Many were hidden or dispersed across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa to prevent any single adversary from seizing the entirety of the collection. They were concealed within monasteries, private estates, underground vaults, and remote sanctuaries, sometimes protected by elaborate mechanisms, cryptic inscriptions, or trusted human guardians. This dispersal ensured that the knowledge encoded within the relics could survive political upheaval, invasion, or persecution. It was a lesson learned from the fall of the Templars. Visibility brought vulnerability, secrecy ensured survival, and strategic foresight preserved continuity. The Order's guardians also recognized that perception shaped reality. To outsiders, many of these relics appeared to be mere ceremonial objects, curiosities, or symbols of devotion. This obscurity was deliberate. The most powerful knowledge the Order had learned should not be flaunted or displayed for acclaim. It should exist in plain sight yet remain invisible, accessible only to those capable of understanding and responsibility. In this way, the relics served as both shields and instruments, protecting wisdom while guiding perception, ensuring that even if discovered, they could not easily be misused. Relics sometimes intersected with broader historical currents. They were deployed discreetly to influence rulers, protect key locations, or preserve knowledge through turbulent times. A chalice or amulet might be entrusted to a loyal ally who could safeguard it. A manuscript might be transported to a secure location while political turmoil raged, or a coded inscription might be added to architecture in a city under threat. These interventions, often invisible to history, exemplify the Order's subtle strategy. Safeguard the past, guide the present, and prepare for the future, all while maintaining secrecy and minimizing risk. The psychological impact of the relics on the Order's members cannot be overstated. Each object carried the weight of centuries of responsibility, the memory of wars fought, of knowledge preserved, and of human lives entrusted to the Order's discretion. The act of guarding a relic was a moral exercise, a constant reminder of the ethical obligations inherent in their mission. Knights and scholars alike understood that failure could reverberate across generations, that the loss of a single object might erase centuries of wisdom, and that each interaction with the relics required clarity of mind, ethical judgment, and unwavering focus. Ultimately, the relics of power were not only historical treasures but instruments of continuity, ethical guidance, and strategic influence. They connected the Order of Solomon to the ancient custodians of Solomon's Temple, to the Templars, and to a lineage of wisdom that transcended time, geography, and political upheaval. Their preservation demanded vigilance, skill, and moral discernment. They were living artifacts, encoded with knowledge, insight, and responsibility, a tangible testament to the Order's enduring mission, to protect not merely the past, but the integrity of human understanding itself. Through these relics, the Order of Solomon exercised a quiet, invisible power, shaping events, guiding decisions, and preserving secrets whose influence would ripple across centuries. They were both symbols and tools, objects that carried the weight of history while directing the course of the future. To hold a relic was to hold a key to understanding, to wield insight responsibly, and to participate in a lineage of guardianship whose legacy remains hidden yet profoundly influential. In every chalice, amulet, or manuscript, the order preserved the memory, wisdom, and foresight of generations, ensuring that the legacy of Solomon's Temple and the Templars endured long after the world believed them lost. The relics of the Order of Solomon were not merely treasured possessions. They were magnets for danger, curiosity, and ambition. Across Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, whispers of hidden objects of immense power spread like faint echoes, reaching ears that could neither resist temptation nor comprehend their true significance. Treasure hunters, rival orders, and even monarchs hungered for these relics, imagining them as instruments of wealth, influence, or supernatural potency. Yet for the Order of Solomon, these objects were far more than symbols of power. They were the lifeblood of a secret lineage, conduits for knowledge preserved across millennia. The pursuit of these relics was as much a test of discernment, patience, and morality as it was a struggle for physical security. The order quickly learned that visibility was perilous. Once a relic's existence became known, it became a target. Thus, members developed intricate methods for concealment. Some relics were hidden within monastic libraries, disguised as ordinary artifacts or buried beneath floors and walls. Others were carried across treacherous terrain, moved under the cover of darkness by knights trained in both stealth and the ethics of preservation. The paths they took were rarely direct. Detours, decoys, and misdirection were essential to ensuring that the knowledge encoded within the objects could survive, even when pursued by those who sought to exploit it. The chase for these relics often led to the creation of secret caches, sometimes disguised as innocuous structures, other times concealed within natural landscapes. A hidden chamber beneath a chapel might house manuscripts and ceremonial objects, accessible only by coded mechanisms known to a select few. In the mountains of Iberia, relics were hidden in caves, protected by traps and encoded symbols that signaled ownership and method of access. Even in cities, objects were sometimes concealed within private estates, under the care of allies who understood the stakes. These methods reflected both ingenuity and a profound understanding of human psychology. The most dangerous predators are often guided by greed, impatience, or hubris, and the order designed their safeguards to exploit these weaknesses. Yet concealment alone was insufficient. The Order of Solomon recognized that a relic could be lost not only to external threats but to human error. Guardianship required constant vigilance, and the members were trained to detect subtle signs of betrayal, curiosity, or distraction. Small lapses in judgment, a misplaced scroll, a casual remark, or a moment of overconfidence could compromise the safety of an entire cache. The Order's members were therefore disciplined not only in physical defense but in observation, analysis, and moral fortitude. Each interaction with a relic was both a test and a lesson, reinforcing the responsibility that came with the stewardship of knowledge. The pursuit of these objects also introduced complex moral challenges. Rival factions, often unaware of the Order's ethical framework, sought relics for power, influence, or fame. In such cases, the Order of Solomon often had to engage in subtle deception or strategic intervention to protect both the relic and the integrity of its knowledge. Sometimes this involved misleading pursuers, creating decoys, or encoding false trails into manuscripts and symbols. Other times, it required negotiation with sympathetic allies who could intercede without compromising secrecy. Each choice was fraught with risk. Exposure, miscalculation, or betrayal could result not only in the loss of an object, but in the erosion of the Order's influence and the potential endangerment of centuries of preserved wisdom. Stories of these pursuits are scattered across time, often obscured by myth or intentional obfuscation. Chroniclers spoke vaguely of vanished treasures, of knights moving through secret corridors, or of relics that disappeared during wars, sieges, or political upheaval. While some accounts were exaggerated or misinterpreted, they reveal a consistent theme. The relics of the Order of Solomon were highly sought after, and their protection required extraordinary foresight, courage, and cunning. In some cases, entire campaigns, some recorded as failures, others as minor skirmishes, were influenced by the need to safeguard these objects, to ensure that they remained in the hands of those who understood their significance. The Order's members often moved relics across continents to ensure their survival. A chalice hidden in a European monastery might be transported to the deserts of North Africa, a manuscript relocated to the hidden sanctuaries of the Levant, and a symbolic artifact moved to the remote hills of Iberia. Each relocation was carefully timed, with routes and methods designed to avoid both natural hazards and human pursuit. These movements were not only practical but symbolic, reinforcing the Order's philosophy that knowledge is alive, dynamic, and requires constant stewardship to endure. Every journey was a ritual of preservation, a testament to the ethical and practical responsibilities inherent in guardianship. The human element of these pursuits was equally critical. Knights and scholars tasked with protecting relics had to remain vigilant against both external and internal threats. Trust was a currency carefully managed, alliances constantly evaluated, and loyalty continually tested. Even among the Order's members, access to certain relics was restricted, layered in secrecy to minimize the risk of compromise. Ethical training, moral discipline, and careful mentorship ensured that those entrusted with the highest responsibilities understood the consequences of failure. The weight of stewardship was immense. Every misstep could imperil knowledge accumulated over centuries, disrupt carefully constructed networks, and expose the Order to enemies both overt and hidden. There were also instances when the Order allowed relics to be temporarily revealed to specific allies, scholars, or rulers, but only under strict protocols. These interventions were calculated to protect the objects, guide decisions, or preserve the cultural and historical knowledge associated with them. Even in such cases, members of the Order ensured that only those deemed capable of ethical stewardship could access the information. The combination of discretion, timing, and moral judgment allowed the Order to wield influence subtly, protecting the past while guiding the present and preparing for an uncertain future. Despite all precautions, some relics were inevitably lost, stolen, or misappropriated over time. Yet the Order's approach to these events was strategic rather than reactive. Losses were often anticipated, mitigated through redundant caches, encoded manuscripts, or the dispersion of knowledge among multiple guardians. When objects fell into unknown hands, the Order observed carefully, assessing whether the knowledge might be misused or whether recovery could be effected. In this way, the pursuit of relics was not merely a physical endeavor but a long-term exercise in strategy, foresight, and ethical vigilance. Ultimately, the chase for these relics illustrates the delicate balance the Order of Solomon maintained between preservation and intervention. They operated in the shadows, protecting objects of immense historical, spiritual, and intellectual value while ensuring that knowledge remained accessible only to those prepared to bear its ethical and practical weight. Their methods combined cunning, foresight, and discipline, demonstrating that true guardianship is as much about moral responsibility and strategic planning as it is about physical protection. The relics were not merely treasures. They were living instruments, teaching lessons across generations, and connecting the Order's members to a lineage stretching back to Solomon's Temple, the Templars, and the hidden custodians who had come before. Through pursuit, concealment, and ethical stewardship, the Order of Solomon ensured that these relics survived centuries of human ambition, warfare, and political intrigue. Each object, whether a chalice, amulet, manuscript, or ceremonial tool, was more than a material artifact. It was a testament to the enduring legacy of wisdom, vigilance, and moral responsibility. The chase for these relics, the hidden paths and secret safekeeping, reflects the Order's profound understanding of the fragile intersection between human desire, knowledge, and power, a knowledge too valuable to reveal, yet too precious to lose. The manuscripts of the Order of Solomon were among its most sacred treasures, a lattice of knowledge and secrecy interwoven across centuries, designed to transmit wisdom without revealing its full scope to the uninitiated. These texts were not simply books. They were living instruments, encoded in symbols, ciphers, and geometrical patterns that communicated layers of meaning, each interpretable only by those who had been trained to perceive them. To an outsider, the pages might appear as theological treatises, philosophical meditations, or obscure historical accounts. But to a member of the Order, Each manuscript was a roadmap to understanding the cosmos, human behavior, and the hidden currents of history itself. The creation of these manuscripts was an art form in itself. Every letter, line, and illustration was deliberately chosen to serve multiple functions: instructional, symbolic, and protective. Marginal notes often contained hidden commentary or encoded instructions, while diagrams and illustrations might map celestial alignments, encode mathematical principles, or record philosophical axioms that could only be deciphered by those initiated in the order's methods. In some cases, the very materials, inks, parchment, or binding methods, were selected to preserve the information across centuries, resistant to decay, tampering, or misinterpretation. The manuscripts were carefully catalogued within the order's secret archives, but their true value was never simply historical. It lay in the lessons they contained and the ethical framework they imparted to those who could read them. Some manuscripts were explicitly designed as layered puzzles. Knowledge within a single text could be divided into multiple strata, with each layer accessible only through a combination of training, insight, and intuition. The first layer might appear as a philosophical or religious meditation, readable by anyone with sufficient literacy. The second layer, however, might require understanding of a cipher based on geometric ratios, astronomical observations, or symbolic patterns derived from Solomon's temple. A third layer could involve cross-referencing with other manuscripts, relics, or locations, demanding a holistic understanding of the order's teachings. These manuscripts were not merely records. They were instruments for training perception, discipline, and moral judgment, teaching initiates to see connections invisible to ordinary eyes. The ethical dimension of these texts was paramount. Each manuscript was a test as well as a lesson. Misinterpretation could lead to errors in judgment, the misuse of knowledge, or even the exposure of secrets to those unprepared to bear them. Novices were instructed not only in the content of the manuscripts but in the principles governing their use: discernment, patience, and moral responsibility. The order's philosophy emphasized that knowledge is a burden as much as a gift. Wisdom, once acquired, must be exercised ethically and with awareness of potential consequences. To study a manuscript without understanding these principles was to court disaster, for the encoded knowledge was powerful precisely because it could be misapplied. Ciphers and codes within the manuscripts varied widely, reflecting the order's long history and accumulated expertise. Some relied on alphanumeric substitutions, while others used geometrical overlays, symbolic iconography, or astrological correspondences. Certain texts were designed to be cross-referenced with specific relics, such that the positioning, orientation, or observation of an object was required to decode a message. The manuscripts were, in essence, living maps, simultaneously guiding, instructing, and testing the initiate's perception, intuition, and ethical awareness. The complexity of these codes ensured that only those properly trained could access the deepest layers of knowledge, while casual observers or ill-prepared readers would perceive only the surface narrative. Illustrations and diagrams within the manuscripts were equally cryptic. Star charts, geometric forms, and symbolic representations often contained embedded instructions for rituals, ethical meditations, or practical applications of knowledge. A single diagram could communicate astronomical cycles, moral principles, and a pathway to a hidden cache or relic simultaneously. The order scribes understood the power of visual symbolism, encoding lessons in forms that required careful study, reflection, and cross-referencing to fully comprehend. Every curve, line, and shape was intentional, a testimony to the meticulous care the order took to preserve knowledge across generations while maintaining secrecy. Manuscripts were also a tool for continuity. As members of the order dispersed over centuries, these texts allowed knowledge to be transmitted without requiring the physical presence of a mentor. An initiate could study a manuscript under the guidance of coded instructions, gradually building comprehension, skill, and ethical awareness. This ensured that even in times of persecution or dispersal, the principles, methods, and secrets of the order could survive. The manuscripts were more than records of wisdom. They were vessels for continuity, preserving the order's teachings and ethical framework for future generations. Some texts were intentionally deceptive to outsiders, containing deliberate misdirections or symbolic contradictions. A passage might appear nonsensical, yet serve as a protective layer, preventing misuse or misunderstanding by those not initiated in the order's methods. Marginal notes could be false trails. Diagrams could contain intentional errors, and certain symbols might only resolve when cross-referenced with other texts or relics. The manuscripts were, in this way, both safeguard and teacher. They protected knowledge while training perception, reinforcing the idea that wisdom requires discernment, patience, and ethical responsibility. The manuscripts also preserved historical and esoteric knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Accounts of ancient civilizations, sacred geometry, astronomical observations, and philosophical principles were interwoven with moral instruction and coded symbols. These texts allowed the Order of Solomon to maintain a continuity of understanding stretching back to the custodians of Solomon's temple and the Templars themselves. By preserving the past in these multi-layered manuscripts, the Order ensured that knowledge could survive even if the physical or political environment became hostile. Over time, manuscripts became a means of subtle influence. Allies, rulers, and scholars could be guided indirectly through coded texts, ritual instructions, or symbolic diagrams. A carefully transmitted manuscript could teach a ruler a principle of governance, inspire a scholar toward discovery, or guide a knight toward the ethical resolution of a conflict, all while preserving the order's secrecy. The manuscripts allowed the Order of Solomon to exercise influence across time and space without revealing its presence, shaping events, and safeguarding knowledge with patience, subtlety, and foresight. The psychological impact of these texts on initiates was profound. The rituals of the Order of Solomon were a tapestry of secrecy, symbolism, and spiritual discipline, designed to cultivate both the intellect and the moral character of its members. They were not performances for the public, nor were they merely ceremonial gestures. Every action, every symbol, and every recitation carried layers of meaning, carefully orchestrated to teach lessons, test perception, and instill ethical responsibility. Initiates entered these rituals aware that they were stepping into a lineage that traced back centuries, into practices that had been preserved through the Templars, and beyond them, to the hidden custodians of Solomon's temple. The weight of history, and the responsibility it imposed, was ever present, a silent yet palpable force guiding each movement, each gesture, and each thought. Rituals began with preparation, both physical and mental. Members would cleanse their bodies and minds, often through meditation, fasting, or physical discipline, bringing themselves into a state of heightened awareness. The order believed that perception was as much spiritual as it was intellectual. The ability to perceive subtle truths, understand encoded knowledge, and navigate complex moral decisions depended on clarity of mind and discipline of spirit. Every detail, from the lighting of candles to the arrangement of ceremonial objects, was calculated to enhance focus, facilitate memory, and align the participant with the symbolic currents of the ritual. Symbols were central to the practice. Geometric shapes, inscriptions, and positions of objects were not decorative but encoded instructions and ethical lessons. Triangles, circles, and squares represented cosmic principles, cycles of time, and philosophical truths. The alignment of a ceremonial chalice or the placement of a scroll could communicate a layered message, guiding the initiate toward insight. These symbols were often repeated across manuscripts, relics, and architecture, creating a cohesive system of instruction that reinforced knowledge through multiple channels. The rituals thus functioned as living textbooks, where action, observation, and contemplation merged into a single, holistic form of learning. Initiates were also tested during rituals. Certain exercises required precise recall, careful observation, and discernment in applying principles to hypothetical or practical situations. One might be asked to decode a symbol embedded in a manuscript or to interpret the placement of objects within a ceremonial circle. Others were tasked with ethical decision-making, balancing competing duties or resolving conflicts in ways that demonstrated both wisdom and restraint. The lessons were subtle yet profound. Success was measured not merely by accuracy, but by moral insight, patience, and the ability to act without ego or self-interest. Mistakes were instructive, but ethical lapses could lead to reprimand, reassignment, or removal from certain aspects of the order's deeper teachings. The rituals also incorporated meditation and visualization techniques, connecting the initiate to broader patterns of history, nature, and human behavior. Participants might visualize the movement of stars, the alignment of sacred architecture, or the flow of human events, learning to perceive relationships and consequences invisible to ordinary perception. This practice reinforced the order's philosophy that knowledge is not merely intellectual but integrative, requiring the alignment of mind, body, and spirit. By cultivating this awareness, the rituals trained members to act with foresight, subtlety, and ethical responsibility, qualities essential for guardians of relics, manuscripts, and hidden knowledge. Music and sound were occasionally used to enhance focus and attune perception. Certain tones, chants, or sequences of sound were believed to resonate with natural and cosmic frequencies, heightening awareness and aiding memory. These elements were subtle, often imperceptible to casual observers, yet effective in reinforcing attention, discipline, and meditation. The combination of sound, movement, and symbolism created an immersive experience, ensuring that lessons were internalized at multiple levels: intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. The rituals were thus multidimensional, teaching through sight, sound, action, and contemplation. The ethical dimension of these ceremonies was always present. Unlike rituals designed for spectacle or social cohesion, the practices of the Order of Solomon were exercises in moral responsibility. Initiates were reminded that knowledge is a burden as well as a gift, that wisdom misapplied can be dangerous, and that power carries consequences far beyond the self. Every decision within the ritual, how to handle an object, interpret a symbol, or respond to a test, was a microcosm of the ethical challenges the Order anticipated in the broader world. In this way, the rituals were both training and evaluation, a controlled environment in which members could develop the judgment necessary to preserve sacred knowledge responsibly. Mentorship was a crucial component. Experienced members guided novices, interpreting complex symbols, offering subtle corrections, and modeling the ethical use of knowledge. This instruction was always discreet, often embedded in action rather than speech, reinforcing the principle that understanding is earned, not freely given. Mentors also transmitted oral traditions, contextualizing the lessons of the rituals within the history of the Order, the Templars, and the ancient custodians of Solomon's Temple. Through this combination of direct instruction and immersive practice, initiates gradually internalized the Order's principles, developing both the skills and the moral compass necessary for guardianship. Secrecy was integral to every ritual. Even among initiates, access to the deepest layers of practice was restricted, with knowledge shared incrementally according to the level of preparation, understanding, and ethical maturity. The Order recognized that premature exposure to certain teachings could be harmful. Misapplied knowledge could threaten not only the individual but the entire lineage. This careful layering ensured that members progressed at a pace aligned with their readiness, preserving the integrity of the Order and safeguarding its treasures, both physical and intellectual. The rituals themselves were thus a form of protection, encoding lessons in a controlled environment where comprehension and responsibility could be assessed. Many rituals were tied to the broader universe, reflecting the Order's belief in the interconnectedness of all things. By the time the Order of Solomon had matured into a fully functioning clandestine network, its reach extended across continents, threading through courts, monasteries, universities, and remote sanctuaries. Unlike overt institutions, the Order operated entirely in shadows, its presence perceived only through subtle influence, whispered guidance, and the preservation of knowledge that could survive generations. Its members understood that the greatest power lies not in visibility, wealth, or armies, but in the careful orchestration of information, trust, and ethical stewardship. They moved like currents beneath the surface of history, shaping events, guiding decisions, and safeguarding secrets that could alter the understanding of faith, governance, and human destiny. The international network was both structured and decentralized. Local cells were empowered to operate independently, maintaining relics, manuscripts, and sacred knowledge in a manner that minimized risk. Communication between cells relied on encoded letters, symbolic markers, and intermediaries who understood the delicate balance between discretion and necessity. The order developed an intricate system of allegiances, drawing on long-standing relationships with sympathetic rulers, scholars, and clergy who could serve as custodians or facilitators without ever fully knowing the breadth of the network. This decentralized structure ensured resilience. Even if one branch were compromised, the continuity of knowledge, relics, and influence would endure. Members of the order were highly selective, chosen for their intellect, discretion, and moral integrity. Nobles, scholars, and clerics were recruited not only for their social influence, but for their ability to understand and safeguard complex knowledge. Ordinary individuals, if deemed suitable, were trained in methods of observation, memory, and coded communication. The order's philosophy emphasized that trust is earned, not granted, and that the responsibility of knowing is inseparable from the responsibility of safeguarding. Each member, regardless of rank, carried both autonomy and accountability, ensuring that the network functioned with both flexibility and discipline. Relays of information were often subtle, disguised within seemingly ordinary interactions. A manuscript delivered to a scholar might contain encoded guidance on a philosophical question or political decision. A gift to a ruler could carry hidden instructions, a strategic suggestion, or a warning. Architecture itself sometimes served as communication. The orientation of a chapel, the placement of a reliquary, or the alignment of a window could encode messages about events, timing, or relational dynamics. These mechanisms allowed the order to exercise influence invisibly, preserving knowledge while shaping events without revealing the custodianship behind them. The order's international reach enabled it to anticipate, respond to, and subtly manipulate events across time and geography. In cities, its members advised scholars, guided explorations, and curated libraries, ensuring that ancient manuscripts and mathematical, philosophical, or religious knowledge survived political upheaval. In courts, the order's influence helped mediate conflicts, guide rulers toward ethically aligned decisions, and protect sacred sites or objects from destruction. Even in regions beyond direct European control, members moved through local networks, securing texts, relics, and sites of significance, blending into the population while carrying out tasks essential to the order's long-term mission. This clandestine network also fostered continuity across generations. Training was rigorous, combining ritual, mentorship, and practical exercises. Novices learned to perceive coded symbols, interpret manuscripts, and navigate ethical dilemmas, all while maintaining discretion. Knowledge was shared incrementally, ensuring that initiates were prepared to bear the responsibilities entrusted to them. Over time, these generations developed an intuitive understanding of both the order's philosophy and the moral weight of guardianship, creating a lineage that could endure political turmoil, persecution, and geographic displacement. The ethical dimension of this influence was central. The order operated under the principle that knowledge is a form of power requiring moral discernment. It was not enough to preserve manuscripts or relics. Members had to ensure that the wisdom was exercised responsibly, guiding decisions that protected lives, preserved faith, and maintained balance in the unfolding world. The invisible nature of their work was itself a safeguard. By shaping events without appearing to act, the order minimized interference while maximizing the ethical application of its knowledge. Every recommendation, every intervention, and every alignment of resources was guided by this dual principle of secrecy and moral responsibility. The order's influence also extended to the academic and intellectual spheres. Universities, libraries, and monasteries became nodes in the network, preserving manuscripts, encouraging research aligned with ethical principles, and safeguarding discoveries that could otherwise have been lost or misapplied. Scholars unknowingly connected to the order were subtly guided toward discoveries, interpretations, and alignments that reinforced the preservation of knowledge. These interventions were carefully calculated to appear natural, as though driven by scholarly curiosity or divine inspiration, rather than by the invisible hand of the Order of Solomon. Political influence was handled with equal subtlety. Kings and advisors who became aware of the order's presence often attributed insight or foresight to divine providence or experience rather than to external guidance. This misperception was deliberate, The order recognized that direct involvement could provoke envy, suspicion, or persecution. By acting invisibly, members could guide the outcomes of negotiations, prevent destructive conflicts, and influence the protection of sacred knowledge, all while preserving plausible deniability. The order's power lay not in domination but in shaping the circumstances that allowed knowledge and ethics to endure. The international reach also allowed for strategic redundancy. Important manuscripts, relics, and encoded instructions were often duplicated, dispersed, or hidden across multiple locations. If one cache were discovered, destroyed, or compromised, others would remain intact. This redundancy ensured continuity, a principle the Order had learned from the downfall of the Templars. By embedding multiple layers of preservation, both physical and symbolic, the Order safeguarded the survival of knowledge even in the face of extraordinary threats, including war, political betrayal, and natural disaster. The psychological sophistication of the network cannot be overstated. Members learned to perceive not only the movements of allies and adversaries but the currents of human ambition, curiosity, and fear. These insights allowed the Order to anticipate threats, design protective measures, and guide decision-making in subtle but effective ways. Every interaction, whether with a ruler, scholar, or common custodian, was calculated to reinforce the preservation of knowledge while mitigating the risk of exposure. The network's invisible operations required constant vigilance, patience, and ethical discernment, balancing the unpredictable elements of human behavior with the certainty of their mission. Even centuries later, remnants of this clandestine network can be glimpsed in scattered manuscripts, preserved relics, and cryptic symbols embedded in architecture, texts, and ritual. Historians and scholars have struggled to trace its influence, often encountering evidence that appears coincidental, fragmented, or incomprehensible without understanding the Order's methods. Yet when examined holistically, patterns emerge. The survival of knowledge, the protection of relics, and the subtle shaping of events all point to a deliberate, coherent system of guardianship and influence, executed with patience, precision, and discretion. Ultimately, the international network of the Order of Solomon illustrates the profound effectiveness of influence exercised invisibly, ethically, and strategically. Through carefully constructed cells, discrete alliances, coded communication, and ethical training, the Order ensured that the wisdom of Solomon's Temple, the legacy of the Templars, and the ethical application of knowledge survived centuries of upheaval. Its members operated unseen, yet their presence shaped the course of events, preserved sacred and intellectual treasures, and ensured continuity of insight across time and space. In this way, the Order became one of history's most enigmatic yet enduring forces, a silent guardian of knowledge whose impact resonates long after the world believed it had vanished.